Hey fam. This is Arcane Paradox. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. What if Pomfrey found 83 Mate-Suppression charms on Harry age 7 and Veela Nation named him sovereign? Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Weight of 83. The thing about Madame Pomfrey was that she never panicked. In 31 years of working the hospital wing at Hogwarts, she had seen a boy regrow every bone in his arm overnight, watched a student turn into a werewolf on a full moon, treated a teacher who had another man's face living on the back of his head, and once, she still didn't talk about this one, extracted a full-grown garden gnome from a third year's left nostril. Panic, in her professional opinion, was a waste of perfectly good diagnostic time. So when the revealing charm she cast over the small, underfed 7-year-old sitting on her examination table came back wrong, she didn't panic. She cast it again. The results were the same. She cast a secondary diagnostic, the kind that cost a qualified healer 3 years of post-apprenticeship study to learn properly and most practitioners only used when they genuinely feared what they might find. Her wand traced slow, careful arcs over Harry Potter's head, his thin shoulders, the two prominent knobs of his spine. The boy sat very still throughout all of it with the particular stillness of a child who had learned that being noticed usually made things worse. The secondary diagnostic settled into a faint gold lattice above his body, a map of his magical core, his physical health, his emotional conditioning, and Pomfrey looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she set her wand on the instrument tray very carefully, so she wouldn't drop it, and walked to her office door and locked it. 83. 83 Mate-Suppression charms layered inside a child's magical core like sediment. Some of them were recent, the outermost layers only 2 or 3 years old. Others were older. So old that they had begun to calcify, bonding to the edges of his core the way scar tissue bonds to a wound, becoming structural, becoming load-bearing. Remove them carelessly and you didn't just hurt the child. You potentially collapsed the entire architecture of his magic inward. Someone had been doing this to him. Systematically. Over years. Starting, if her reading of the deepest layers was correct, before he could walk. Pomfrey sat down at her desk because her legs suggested this would be a good idea. She had been asked to conduct this examination because Harry Potter was coming to Hogwarts in 4 years. That was the official reason, a routine pre-enrollment wellness check that Dumbledore himself had requested, a gesture of care for the famous boy, entirely ordinary, nothing to worry about. She had fled to the address in Surrey on a Tuesday morning with her bag and her diagnostic kit and a pleasant smile, and Mrs. Dursley had opened the door looking at Pomfrey the way most people looked at unexpected bills. The boy had been summoned from the garden, where he'd been pulling weeds. His hands were dirty. He was noticeably smaller than his cousin, who had lurked in the hallway eating a biscuit and staring. When Pomfrey had said hello, Harry Potter had looked up at her with green eyes that were too watchful for a 7-year-old and said, politely, that he was pleased to meet her. She had brought him to Hogwarts for the examination because her equipment here was better. Dumbledore had approved it. Vernon Dursley had looked relieved. Now she sat in her locked office and thought about what to do next, which was unusual, because Pomfrey's general approach to problems was to fix them and document the fixing. Thinking about what to do was for administrators and politicians. She was a healer. But this was not a straightforward fixing situation. This was a situation where the fixing would require removing 83 charms from a child's magical core without killing him, and where the question of who had put them there sat in the room with her like a large unwelcome animal. She unlocked her office door and went back to Harry. He was still sitting on the examination table. He'd found a loose thread on his overlarge jumper, it was his cousin's, clearly, 3 sizes too big, and was winding it around his finger, then unwinding it, methodically. He looked up when she came back in, and there it was again, that watchfulness. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. "No," she said, and she was surprised by how fiercely she meant it. "No, sweetheart. You're not in any trouble at all." He didn't entirely believe her. She could see that. But he nodded. "I'm going to need to keep you here for a little while longer," she said. Is that all right? Harry considered this with the gravity of a small judge. The Dursleys won't like it. I'll handle the Dursleys. Something crossed his face, quick, there and gone. It might have been relief. She sent a Patronus to Dumbledore before she did anything else, because that was protocol and because she needed him here, regardless of whatever her instincts were starting to hiss at her about where those charms had come from. She sent one to St. Mungo's as well, to Healer Stroud, who was the best magical corps specialist in Britain and owed her a favor from 1987. Then she conjured a comfortable chair next to the examination table, sat down in it, and told Harry Potter that she was going to explain what she'd found. He listened the way he did everything else, still, attentive, those green eyes tracking her face. She told him about the Mate-Suppression charms. She used plain language. She told him that they were charms that worked on a part of his magic that he would have learned about naturally as he got older, a part that connected him to certain people in a certain way, and that having 83 of them stacked in his core meant that part of his magic had been locked down, which had in turn been slowly restricting other parts of his magic, the way a kink in a garden hose affected the whole flow of the water. So my magic has been. Harry turned the idea over. Smaller than it should be? Yes. Considerably. How much smaller? She thought about how to answer that honestly without frightening him. Then she decided he had probably earned honesty. We won't know until we remove the charms. But the suppression is significant. What you've been experiencing as your magic, your entire magical identity, the way your core expresses itself, has been limited. Harry was quiet for a moment. Who put them there? Pomfrey had expected this question and still didn't have a satisfying answer for it. I don't know yet. He looked at her steadily. But you have a guess. 7 years old, she thought. This child was 7 years old. I have some preliminary thoughts, she said carefully, that I will be pursuing through the appropriate channels. Harry seemed to decide this was the most he was getting on that particular subject and moved on with a pragmatism that made her chest ache a little. What happens when you take them off? That's what we need to be very careful about. Removing suppression charms isn't simple, not when there are this many, and not when some of them have been there since you were very young. Healer Stroud is coming to help. It will need to be done in stages, over several sessions. Does it hurt? Some of it may be uncomfortable. But we will do our absolute best to make it as easy as possible. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to winding the thread around his finger. Then he said, not looking at her, the gold thing you made with your wand. Over my head. Was it really bad? Pomfrey reached out and put her hand over his, stilling the thread winding. What it showed me, she said, is that someone did something to you that they had absolutely no right to do. And I intend to make sure that doesn't continue. That's all you need to know for right now. He looked at her hand over his for a moment. Then, with what she suspected was a great deal more courage than it looked like, he turned his hand over and held hers back. Dumbledore arrived 40 minutes later, stepping out of the hospital wing fireplace with his robes settling around him and that expression he wore when he was preparing to be kind and wise and calming. He was very good at that expression. Pomfrey had seen it work on parents, on students, on ministry officials and foreign dignitaries and grieving families. She showed him the diagnostic results. The expression didn't exactly fall. It was more that it became very careful. Poppy, he said. 83, she said. The oldest layers are pre-verbal. Before he could walk or speak. I can see that. Can you explain them? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, looking at the lattice of gold light above the parchment where she'd printed the results. His eyes, usually so blue and warm and certain, were doing something she didn't have a name for. The situation with Harry, he said finally, has always been extraordinarily complex. Albus. She kept her voice level. Can you explain the 83 Mate-Suppression charms in this child's magical core? Another silence. Outside the office door, she could hear Harry on the examination table, the small sounds of a child existing quietly in a space, waiting. The mate-bond connection Harry carries, Dumbledore said, and his voice was measured, professorial, would have been deeply complicated. Given his destiny. Given Voldemort. A mate bond in play could have been catastrophic, a weakness to be exploited, a pressure point, a leverage. The charms were a protection. A protection, Pomfrey repeated. Of a kind. 83 of them. Starting before he was a year old. Dumbledore looked at her then, and she saw in his face something she hadn't expected, not guilt, exactly, but a kind of profound, settled certainty that what he had done was right. That was almost worse than guilt. Guilt implied doubt. This was a man who had arranged the systematic magical suppression of an infant and filed it under necessary measures without losing a night's sleep. The protections kept him alive, he said. They kept Voldemort from being able to trace the bond. They kept the people connected to Harry safe. They also, Pomfrey said, and she was very proud of how steady her voice was, constituted illegal magical interference with a minor. Repeated. Sustained. Without parental consent, given that his parents were dead. Without any oversight or documentation. Without his knowledge. For 7 years. Dumbledore didn't flinch. In service of the greater, do not say greater good to me right now, Albus. The words came out harder than she intended. He looked at her. She didn't apologize. Healer Stroud is coming, she said. I am filing a full diagnostic report with St. Mungo's, as is required by law when illegal magical interference with a minor is discovered. Harry stays here tonight. I will be handling the Dursleys. And I will need your cooperation with the removal process, not your oversight, not your guidance, your cooperation, because if you make this difficult I will involve the Department of Magical Law Enforcement before you can say for the greater good, and I mean every word of that. Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. His expression had done something complicated, she thought she saw, buried very deep, something that might eventually become regret if given enough time and pressure. Of course, he said quietly. Harry's well-being is paramount. Yes, she agreed. It is. He left. She stood at her office window and watched the grounds for a moment, the September afternoon sunlight on the lake, the way the castle felt so permanent and sure of itself. Then she went back to Harry. Healer Stroud arrived at 6 in the evening, tore through the diagnostic results in 20 minutes, said several things in a row that Pomfrey was fairly sure qualified as profanity in at least 4 languages, and then settled in with a calm professionalism that Pomfrey deeply respected. We start with the outer 3 layers tonight, Stroud said. Gentlest ones. Let his core adjust before we go deeper. Harry had been given dinner, proper dinner, not the small precise portion Mrs. Dursley had specified when Pomfrey had fled to renegotiate the schedule, and was sitting up in one of the hospital beds with a slightly dazed expression that might have been from the food or might have been from the day in general. Both, probably. You're going to start tonight, he asked. Just the first 3, Stroud said. She was a compact, direct woman with close-cropped silver hair and the particular manner of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that she'd developed an allergy to softening it. They won't hurt. You might feel a sort of looseness. Like taking off a tight shoe. Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he said, okay. Stroud cast. It was delicate, precise work, nothing like the heavy, hammering magic Pomfrey had seen some healers use when they were in a hurry. Stroud worked like she was picking a lock, like each motion mattered, and Pomfrey watched from a chair in the corner and thought about 83, and about a man who was very certain he had done the right thing. The first charm lifted. Harry went very still. His eyes widened fractionally. All right? Stroud asked. Yeah, Harry said, and his voice was slightly different, something in it that hadn't been there before, a note she couldn't name, like a string that had been playing flat suddenly hitting the right pitch. Yeah, that's strange. Strange how? He thought about it. He was very precise about thinking before he spoke, Pomfrey had noticed. Like I've been hearing everything through a wall, he said slowly, and someone opened a window. Stroud nodded and went to the second one. By the time all 3 outer charms were removed, Harry was sitting slightly differently, his posture had shifted, subtle but real, his chin a fraction higher. He was looking at his own hand like it had surprised him. "Can you feel a difference?" Pomfrey asked. "My hand is doing something," Harry said, and he turned it palm up on the blanket, and a small, clean spark of gold light bloomed in the center of it. Just sat there. Warmth and light in the cupped hand of a 7-year-old, patient and bright. Stroud made a note. Her expression was professional. Pomfrey could tell she was working hard to keep it that way. "What color is your magic usually?" Stroud asked. Harry frowned. "I didn't know magic had colors." Which was, Pomfrey thought, really all that needed to be said about what those 7 years had cost him. She fled back to Surrey that night to speak to the Dursleys. Vernon Dursley was a large, purple-faced man who filled doorways the way some men filled rooms, all assertion and territorial certainty. He stood in the entrance of No. 4 Privet Drive and looked at Pomfrey the way he probably looked at most things that confused him, with a kind of aggressive suspicion, as though confusion were an insult he intended to return. "Is the boy in trouble?" he said, instead of hello. "No," Pomfrey said. "Mr. Dursley, I need to speak with you and your wife about what I found in Harry's examination today." She kept it clinical. She told them about the suppression charms, not all the details, just the essential facts. As she spoke, Petunia Dursley, who had appeared behind her husband's shoulder, went through 3 distinct shades of pale. "I don't know anything about that," Vernon said, which was almost certainly true, because Vernon Dursley was not a man with access to mate-suppression charms or the knowledge to cast them. Petunia, however, had gone the specific grey of someone who knew something they wished they didn't. "Mrs. Dursley," Pomfrey said. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" We don't, we were told he needed to be kept normal," Petunia said, and her voice had gone high and strained. "We were told it was for his safety. They said it needed to be renewed. Every so often. We never asked, who?" Pomfrey said. "Who told you? Who renewed them?" Petunia pressed her lips together. She was frightened, Pomfrey realized, but whether she was more frightened of the truth coming out or of the man who had apparently been making house calls to perform charms on her nephew, it was hard to say. "An old man," Petunia said finally. "Long white beard. He always came at night. The last time was," she counted. 2 winters ago. Pomfrey drove back to Hogwarts with her Patronus already sent ahead. 2 winters ago. The outermost layers were 2 or 3 years old. The timing was consistent. It was all consistent, all of it pointing in the same direction, and Pomfrey had spent 31 years working in a castle with that man and considered him a friend and was now sitting with something she couldn't unknow, couldn't unfeel, couldn't neatly file and move on from. She was going to do her job. She was going to remove those charms, one careful session at a time, and document everything, and protect this child. That was certain. What was equally certain was that this was not going to stay quiet. It didn't. The St. Mungo's filing went through on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it had crossed the desk of Healer-in-Chief Marguerite Abbott, who was a thorough woman with deeply held views about the rights of magical children and a direct fluke connection to 3 separate Wisengamot members. By Friday afternoon, it had reached someone in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, not through any deliberate leak, just through the simple, unstoppable mechanics of a serious document moving through institutional channels. By Saturday, the news had slipped sideways out of official government entirely, because news always found sideways routes when it was significant enough, and the only question was where it went next. It went, as it turned out, to France. This was because an attaché at the British Ministry's office in Paris had a cousin who worked in Healer records at St. Mungo's, and that attaché had a contact at the office of the Veela nation's diplomatic consul, Madame Perrine Voss, who received the information on a Sunday morning over coffee and sat with it for approximately 4 seconds before she understood exactly what she was looking at. The Veela nation's laws regarding mate suppression were ancient and absolute. They predated the International Statute of Secrecy. They predated the British Ministry of Magic. They had their own court, their own jurisdiction, their own enforcement mechanisms, and they had been honored by every major wizarding government for 7 centuries because the Veela nation was not an organization you chose to antagonize lightly. Under those laws, the discovery of a suppressed mate, particularly one suppressed with this volume of charms, over this duration, beginning in infancy, triggered an automatic legal process. An investigation. A notification of the suppressed party. And a formal evaluation for sovereign status, which was reserved for cases so egregious, so deliberate, and so extended that the nation deemed the individual required active, permanent protection under Veela law. There had been 4 sovereigns in recorded Veela history. Madame Voss looked at the details in the document in front of her, 83 charms, 7 years old, beginning before age 1, and reached for her best writing quill. She had a letter to send to Apollon Delacour. Back at Hogwarts, Harry Potter did not know about any of this. What he knew was that Madame Pomfrey had, over 3 Tuesday and Thursday afternoon sessions, removed 7 suppression charms in total, and that each one came off like an additional window opening in a room he'd been living in without realizing it was dark. He wasn't sure how to explain it better than that. It was the only way the feeling made sense when he turned it over in his mind late at night, lying in the hospital bed that Pomfrey had apparently decided he was staying in during this process regardless of what the Dursleys thought about it. His magic felt different. Not wildly, explosively different, there hadn't been any lightning bolts or rooms catching fire. It was quieter than that and somehow bigger for the quietness. When he reached for it, just reached, the same instinctive way he'd always reached for it when something really frightened him or something really needed to move, it was there in a way it hadn't been before. Not straining, not a distant unreliable thing. Just present. Immediate. His. He made a teacup walk across the table on the second day without meaning to. Pomfrey had noted it down without blinking. Stroud had muttered something about baseline recalibration and written 3 lines of cramped notation. Harry had looked at the walking teacup and felt, for the first time in memory, like something had gone right. He was sitting at the window of the hospital wing on the afternoon of the 3rd week when Dumbledore came to see him. Harry had met Dumbledore before, once, just after his parents died, though that was more of a presence at the edge of memory than an actual meeting, and twice in the years since, brief supervised visits that Harry had later understood were about assessing him rather than seeing him. He was a very tall, very old man who wore extraordinary clothes and carried a quality of authority so complete it seemed woven into the air around him. Harry had always been told that Dumbledore was the person who had kept him safe. He was working through some questions about that. Dumbledore sat in the chair across from him, and smiled, and said, "How are you feeling, Harry?" "Better," Harry said. "Every time Healer Stroud takes another one off, I feel better." "I'm glad to hear it." Harry looked at him. "Were you trying to help me?" he asked. "With the charms?" The question sat in the air between them. Dumbledore's expression did something careful. "It's complicated," Dumbledore began. "I'm 7, Harry said, "not stupid." Dumbledore blinked. It was, possibly, the first time in a long time that anyone had interrupted him like that. "The decisions made on your behalf," Dumbledore said, and his voice was measured, kind, the voice of a man used to leading people through difficult terrain by lantern light, "were made with your long-term safety as the primary. You put charms on my magic," Harry said. 83 of them. Before I could talk. "To protect, you made my magic smaller," Harry said, and his voice was perfectly even, and the spark of gold light that had appeared in his palm on the first evening appeared again now, just sat there in his cupped hand, patient and steady. "For my whole life. And you didn't tell me. And you didn't ask." Dumbledore looked at the gold light in Harry's hand. Something moved through his eyes, complex, layered, not easily named. "Some things," he said quietly, require us to make painful choices on behalf of others who cannot yet understand the full scope. I understand the scope fine, Harry said. Someone locked part of me away so it'd be easier to manage me. That's the scope. The gold light in his hand pulsed once, warm and unhurried. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are very like your mother." What was she like? It was a genuine question, he couldn't help it, it just came out, and he saw it land, saw the old man's face do something that was, in spite of everything, grief. She was brilliant, Dumbledore said. And she was not afraid of anything she thought was wrong. She would have, he stopped. She would have been angry, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore agreed. She would have been very angry. Harry looked back out the window. The October afternoon was grey and cold and the lake was flat and still and enormous. He thought about a woman with red hair who had apparently not been afraid of anything, and wondered what she would have done in his place, and thought that probably she would have done something very direct and very determined and not especially interested in making it easy for anyone who deserved difficulty. "I'm not done being angry," Harry told the window. "I wanted you to know that." Behind him, Dumbledore said nothing. The gold light sat in Harry's palm and did not go out. The letter from Madame Voss arrived at the Ministry on a Wednesday, officially addressed to the Office of Magical Law Enforcement with a formal Veela Nation diplomatic seal that the receiving clerk handled with the particular carefulness of someone holding something that could bite. The letter from Apollon Delacour, sent through private channels, not official ones, arrived at Hogwarts the same afternoon, carried by a bird that was not quite an owl. It was a larger, more elegant creature, ivory-feathered, that landed on the hospital wing windowsill and regarded Pomfrey with amber eyes until she untied the letter, then departed without waiting for a response. Pomfrey read the letter. "Read it again." Set it on her desk and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Then she walked to Harry's bed, where he was reading. She'd brought him books, proper ones, starting with a general magical theory primer and working up from there, because whatever he'd been taught at his Muggle school was apparently functional at best, and she sat down. "Harry," she said. "I have something to tell you. It's big." He marked his page and put the book down, and looked at her with those green eyes, that watchfulness, the thing in him that was already, even at 7, even under the weight of 76 remaining charms, not small. Never really small, even when everything had been arranged to make him so. "When they put the suppression charms on your magic," she said carefully, "they were suppressing something specific. A mate bond. Do you know what that is?" "The book mentioned it," he said. "Like a deep magical connection. Between people." "Yes. Usually between a magical person and a Veela, or between two people who carry compatible magical signatures. It's rare. When it's present, it's significant." She drew a breath. "The Veela Nation, they have their own laws, their own government. They've been contacted about what happened to you. And under their laws, what was done, the number of charms, how long they were in place, how early they began, it qualifies you for something called sovereign status." Harry was very still. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Pomfrey said, "that the Veela Nation intends to formally recognize you as a sovereign. As someone under their protection and their law. It means," she hesitated, because the implications were enormous and she was still working through them herself. "It means your legal standing changes. Significantly. The Veela Nation has authority that predates the British ministry. They are not asking the ministry's permission." Harry looked at her for a long moment. "And they're doing this because they want to protect me," he said. "Or because I'm useful?" 31 years. She had never been asked a question like that by a 7-year-old. "Both, probably," she said honestly. "But protecting you is real. The sovereign designation is not a title they give lightly. It carries genuine weight." He turned and looked out the window, and she could see him thinking, working through it with that careful, systematic mind, turning it over the way he turned everything over. "The woman who wrote the letter," he said. "Apollon Delacour. She's coming here. She wants to. I said I'd ask you. Harry nodded slowly. Then he said, can I meet her first? Before it's official. Just to, he seemed to search for the right word. To see what she's like. Yes, Pomfrey said. I think that's exactly the right instinct. He nodded again, like something had been settled. Outside the window, the lake was dark with the coming evening, and the castle's lights had begun to come on in the towers, and somewhere in France a woman was already packing for a trip to Britain, carrying with her the weight of 7 centuries of Veela law and the particular, focused attention of a nation that had been watching and was now ready to act. Harry Potter picked his book back up. He was 7 years old. He was sitting in a hospital wing with 76 suppression charms still locked in his magical core, and his name was already moving through channels of power he didn't fully understand yet. But the gold light was still there when he called it. Still steady. Still his. That, he had decided, was enough for now. Chapter 2, The Speaker Arrives. Apollon Delacour did not travel like a diplomat. She traveled like a woman who had somewhere to be and considered the concept of obstacles a personal insult. She arrived at Hogsmeade Station on a Thursday morning with one trunk, a leather satchel that clinked faintly when she moved, and her daughter, who was 14 and had opinions about everything and expressed them at full volume in both French and English depending on which language offered the more satisfying word. I don't see why I had to come, Fleur said, stepping off the train onto the platform and looking at the Scottish sky with the expression of someone who had expected better from it. Her hair was silver blonde and moved in the wind like it was doing it on purpose. Several people on the platform stopped walking without entirely realizing they'd done it. Because I am not leaving you in Paris unsupervised for a week, Apollon said, without looking up from the document she was reading while walking, which should have been impossible on a cobblestone platform but which she managed with the ease of long practice. I am 14. I know how old you are, Sherry. I was there. Fleur made a sound that was not quite a word in any language and pulled her coat tighter against the cold. The village ahead of them was small and very English and very grey, with a pub already open despite the morning hour and a joke shop with something green moving in the window. She looked at it with narrowed eyes as they passed. The sovereign is 7, she said. Yes. And we're here because what was done to him was done deliberately, over years, by people with access and power, and the nation does not ignore that. You know this. Apollon finally put the document away, tucking it into the satchel with the ease of someone who had filed court briefs while doing considerably more difficult things. Also because his healer is the only adult in this situation who appears to have behaved correctly, and she asked that we come in person. What's he like? Apollon considered the question. I don't know yet. I've only read the file. What does the file say? That he is 7 years old, that he has survived things that would have broken most adults, and that when Madame Pomfrey explained sovereign status to him, his first question was whether we wanted to protect him or use him. She paused. I found that interesting. Fleur was quiet for a moment. They were walking up the main street now, passing a witch in a purple cloak who was trying to levitate a very large wheel of cheese without much success. That's a smart question. Yes, Apollon agreed. It is. Pomfrey met them in the entrance hall. She was a compact, efficient woman who had apparently decided that pleasantries were for people with more time, which Apollon respected. They shook hands in the manner of two professionals establishing that they were both serious people who intended to get things done, and then Pomfrey said, he knows you're coming. I told him this morning. How did he react? He asked if he could have his examination first. Apollon raised an eyebrow. We're removing another set of charms today, Pomfrey explained, walking briskly and clearly expecting them to keep up. He said he'd rather meet you with fewer of them on. His phrasing was, a slight pause, something crossing her face that might have been fond. He said he'd rather meet you as more of himself than less. Fleur, walking behind them, made a small sound. Not her earlier dismissive sound. Something more attentive. They waited in Pomfrey's office, Apollon reviewing her notes, Fleur reading a Hogwarts student guide she'd found on the shelf with the focused attention she gave to anything involving new information, while Healer Stroud worked in the ward beyond the door. It took about 40 minutes. Apollon could hear, very faintly, the low precise cadence of Stroud's casting. Then silence. Then Pomfrey's voice, and a boy's voice answering. When the office door opened, Harry Potter was not what Apollon had been picturing. She wasn't sure exactly what she'd been picturing. The file described a small, underfed child with unusual magical potential and a history of neglect. What walked through the door was, technically accurate to that description. Yes, he was small for his age, his clothes were still too big, he was wearing glasses that sat slightly askew on his face because one arm was bent. But there was something in the way he moved, in the direct, assessing quality of his green eyes, that made the words small and underfed feel like descriptions of a container that had very little to do with what was inside it. He looked at Apollon. Not at Fleur, though Fleur was, objectively, someone most people's eyes moved to first. He looked at Apollon, held the look, and said, "You're Madame Delacour." "I am," she said. "And you are Harry Potter." "Yeah." He came in and sat down at the chair across from her desk, because Pomfrey had clearly set up the office for this meeting, and he sat in it the way he apparently did everything, with a settled, thoughtful calm that felt older than his age without being false. He noticed Fleur then, glanced at her, then back to Apollon. "Who's this?" "My daughter, Fleur." Fleur gave a sort of regal nod. Harry gave a sort of ordinary nod back, as if they'd established something mutually satisfactory, and returned his attention to Apollon. "Madame Pomfrey says you've come about the sovereign thing," he said. "Yes. Though I would like to explain it properly before we discuss it, if that's all right." He considered this. "What does properly mean?" "It means I'd like to start from the beginning. The actual beginning." Apollon opened her satchel and produced a flat, thin book, old, clearly, the cover worn to softness. "Have you heard much about the Veela nation?" "Only what I've read this week." His eyes went to the book with the specific attention of someone who had discovered reading late and was making up for lost time. "What have you read?" "That you're a sovereign magical people. That you have your own laws and courts. That your authority is older than most wizarding governments." A pause. "And that Mate-Suppression is, that you take it seriously." "We take it very seriously," Apollon said. "Because it is a crime, under Veela law, that carries penalties beyond almost anything else we prosecute. The reason is historical." She leaned forward slightly. 300 years ago, a Veela's mate, a young man from a political family, was suppressed by his own father. The intention was to prevent the bond from completing, because the father considered the match politically inconvenient. The young man lived his entire life without knowing what had been taken from him. He was not happy. His magic was limited. He never understood why. Harry was very still. When this was discovered, after his death, Apollon continued, the nation passed its most severe law, that Mate-Suppression constitutes not merely assault, but a fundamental theft of identity. It cannot be justified by circumstance. It cannot be excused by intention. Not protective intent, not political necessity, not any version of it was for their own good. She held his gaze. "Are you following me?" "You're telling me," Harry said slowly, "that it doesn't matter why they did it." "Correct. And sovereign status, that's for cases like mine. For cases of extraordinary severity. For sovereigns in 7 centuries, Harry. 83 charms, beginning before you could walk. If that does not qualify as extraordinary severity, the designation has no meaning." She set her hands flat on the desk, a deliberate gesture. She knew it read as grounding, as sincerity, and she meant it to. "But I want to be clear about what sovereign status is and what it isn't. It is not a cage. It is not a leash. It is not the nation claiming ownership of you. Then what is it?" Legally, it establishes that you are under Veela jurisdiction for any matters relating to the suppression, the bond, and any subsequent legal proceedings. It grants you protections that British ministry law cannot override. It means that anyone who wishes to take legal action against you for any reason must come through our courts first. She paused. In practice, it means that the people who did this to you answer to us. And we are not, a slight, precise edge entered her voice, as easily managed as the British ministry. Harry was quiet. He looked at the worn book in front of Apollon, then out the window at the castle grounds, then back at her. "What do you want from me?" he said. There it was again, the same question, direct and unadorned, the question of a child who had learned very early that kindness and interest from adults carried price tags. "To be honest with you," Apollon said. "Which I intend to continue doing. There are factions within the nation who see your situation as politically useful, who would like to use the sovereign designation as leverage against the British ministry on several matters that have nothing to do with you. I want you to know that exists." Harry blinked. It was, she thought, possible that this was the first time a powerful adult had led with an admission of the ways she might be used by the institution behind them. "You're telling me that?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you asked a smart question before you met me, and I don't intend to waste a smart question with a diplomatic non-answer." She sat back. "My position is that your protection and your autonomy are the purpose of this process, not political leverage. I will be transparent with you, and I will tell you when pressures exist that you should know about. In return, I ask only that you tell me when something doesn't sit right with you. This only works if we are honest with each other." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something being decided. "All right," Harry said. "I can do that." Apollon nodded once. "Then let's talk about what happens next." The next 3 hours were, in Fleur's opinion, some of the stranger hours of her life, and her life had already included several incidents that qualified as strange. She had expected to sit in the corner of Pomfrey's office and be decorative and bored while her mother conducted legal proceedings with a 7-year-old. What actually happened was that Harry Potter, approximately 40 minutes into the meeting, looked at her and said, "You've been reading the same page for 20 minutes. She had, in fact, been listening and losing her page because of it. "I have not." Page 43. "You turned to it when Mammon started talking about jurisdictional overlap, and you've been there since." She looked down. Page 43. She looked back up. He had gone back to asking her mother a question about appeals processes. She closed the student guide and listened openly, which felt less peculiar than being caught. He asked good questions, was the thing. Not just smart questions, good ones, the kind that found the pressure points in explanations, the gaps between what was said and what was meant. He asked her mother what happened if the British ministry contested sovereign status, and when Apollon explained the treaty structure, he asked which treaties were most recently renewed and which were older and therefore potentially more vulnerable to reinterpretation. Apollon had paused and then answered with a small, not quite hidden expression of respect. He was 7. Fleur kept coming back to that. She was 14 and sitting in on conversations about international magical law and finding them interesting but demanding. He was 7, with 76 suppression charms still in his magical core, taking this in and processing it and asking about treaty vulnerability. She thought about what her mother had said on the walk up. His first question was whether we wanted to protect him or use him. At one point Harry got up to pour himself a glass of water from the jug on Pomfrey's desk, reaching up for it without self-consciousness, filling the glass, sitting back down, and Fleur noticed that when he moved, the air around him did something faintly unusual. Not visible, nothing dramatic. Just a kind of quality, like the air had more weight in his vicinity. More presence. Like he took up more space than his size suggested. That was the mate bond, or the beginnings of it. She recognized it academically, from what her mother had told her and what she'd read. She was Veela, she would sense it more keenly than a human would, and she filed the feeling away in the part of her mind she used for important information. After her mother had finished the formal portion and they had moved on to what Apollon called practical scheduling, Harry looked at Fleur and said, "What school do you go to?" "Beaux Batons," she said. "Is it good?" "It is excellent," she said, and then, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving it there, "though I understand Hogwarts has a superior Quidditch pitch." Harry looked at her blankly. "What's Quidditch?" It took Fleur a moment to remember that he hadn't grown up knowing he was a wizard. "Oh," she said. "Right." She considered. "It's a game. On broomsticks. A beat. You would be very good at it." "How do you know?" She tilted her head. "You have good spatial awareness. I watched you navigate around the desk and the chair and the stack of files without looking at any of them." He looked at her for a moment with those green eyes. Then he said, "What position do you play?" "I don't play Quidditch." "Why not?" "Because I have not yet found a version of it that seems worth the effort of learning, given that the regulations were written by people who clearly favored aggression over skill." He considered this. "What do you do instead?" "Dueling," she said. "And theoretical ward construction." A pause. "And I read more than 43 pages at a time." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the suggestion of one, like the architecture of a smile was present but he hadn't finished building it yet. "I only started reading this week," he said. "I'm working up to it." "The book Maman showed you," Fleur said. "The nation's founding charter. Do you want to read it?" He looked at the book. Then at her. "Can I?" She crossed the room and handed it to him, because apparently that was the sort of thing she was doing now. Dumbledore asked to meet with Apollon at 4 in the afternoon. He was gracious, because he was always gracious, and his office was warm and impeccably arranged in the way of spaces that wanted you to feel welcomed and slightly off balance at the same time. Fawkes was on his perch. The portraits on the walls watched with the polite attentiveness of people listening to a conversation they'd agreed not to comment on. Apollon sat down, accepted tea, and waited. "I want to say," Dumbledore began, in the tone of a man preparing to navigate carefully, "that I am genuinely glad Harry is receiving the attention and care of the nation. His welfare has always been my primary concern." "I'm sure," Apollon said pleasantly. "The sovereign designation," however, he set down his cup. "I have some concerns about timing. Harry is young. He is at the very beginning of understanding his own magical identity. Placing the full weight of sovereign status upon a 7-year-old, with all the political attention that will follow, what alternative would you suggest?" Apollon said. "We wait. We wait until he is 8. 10. We wait until the remaining 76 charms have been in place long enough to cause permanent damage." Dumbledore's expression acknowledged that this was a fair point without conceding anything. "I am simply suggesting that a graduated approach, Professor Dumbledore." Apollon set down her own cup with a precise click. "The nation has reviewed the diagnostic report. We have read Healer Stroud's documentation. We have read Madame Pomfrey's testimony." She met his gaze directly. "We have also reviewed the dates. The most recent layers of suppression were placed 2 years ago. At that time, Harry was 5. Whoever renewed those charms made a deliberate choice to continue the suppression at 5 years old, knowing what they were doing." Dumbledore was very still. "The sovereign designation is not primarily about protecting Harry from external threats," Apollon said. "It is about establishing, in terms that cannot be revised or managed away, that what was done to him is documented, is serious, and will not be permitted to continue." She tilted her head slightly. "I imagine you understand the legal implications." "I understand them quite well." "Then I imagine you also understand that we intend to pursue formal accountability for the individuals responsible for those charms." "All of them. Regardless of station." The fire crackled. Fawkes ruffled his feathers with a small musical sound and settled again. "Harry will need guidance," Dumbledore said. He will need people who understand the full scope of what he faces. Voldemort is not before us today, Apollon said. Harry Potter's safety from Voldemort is a separate matter from Harry Potter's right to exist unmolested within his own magical core. I will not allow one to be used as justification for the other. Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. He was, she thought, a man of genuine intelligence and genuine belief, and the combination made him dangerous in a specific way. He would not be argued out of his position because he had not argued himself into it. He had arrived there through a kind of crystallized certainty that was immune to external pressure. I hope, he said finally, that in proceeding with the nation's agenda, we don't lose sight of what this child's life will require of him. I hope, Apollon replied, that in protecting what you consider his destiny, you don't forget that he is also a person. She stood. Thank you for the tea. The sovereign designation will be formalized within the fortnight. She left him sitting with Fawkes, who made a low, complex sound that might have been commentary. The news broke publicly on a Friday. Not because anyone in the nation had leaked it, the Veela were meticulously careful about their formal processes, but because someone at the ministry, one of the clerks who had handled the incoming Veela diplomatic correspondence, had mentioned it to their partner, who had mentioned it to their sister, who worked at Which Weekly, and so on. The version that appeared in print was patchy and sensational. Boy WHO lived in Veela custody. And mystery illness brings chosen one to hospital, what Dumbledore isn't telling us. Pomfrey used the paper to line a birdcage. Harry read it in the hospital wing on a Saturday morning and looked up and said, "That's mostly wrong." "That's mostly inevitable," Pomfrey said. "They keep calling me the boy who lived." "That's what people call you." "I don't like it," he said, not particularly distressed, just noting a fact. "It's like they're describing the moment I survived instead of me." He put the paper down. "Can people come visit? Or is it, who did you have in mind?" He seemed slightly self-conscious for the first time. I don't know anyone here. I just wondered." A pause. "Is Fleur still in the castle?" "She and Madame Delacour are staying in the guest quarters until Monday." Pomfrey looked at him. "I can let her know you asked, if you'd like." He thought about it. "Yeah, all right." 20 minutes later, Fleur arrived with the nation's founding charter under one arm and a book she'd apparently taken from the school library under the other, a history of Veela law, annotated in the margins in faint pencil by someone who'd had strong feelings about treaty structures. She dropped into the chair beside his bed with the ease of someone who had decided a decision was made and wasn't revisiting it. "I found it," she said, holding up the annotated history. "Someone at this school has spent an enormous amount of time being wrong about Veela jurisdiction in the 3rd century. I thought you should know." "I don't know enough yet to know that's wrong," Harry said. "No, but I do, so I'll tell you." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved over slightly on the bed, which was wide enough, and she, not entirely planning to, and then deciding it was fine, sat sideways on the end of it and opened the annotated book. They read like that for 2 hours, Fleur correcting the margins' wrong-headed annotations aloud, Harry asking questions that occasionally made her look up and reconsider something she'd thought was obvious. Outside, the Scottish autumn made its usual grey arguments. Inside, it was warm, and the books were interesting, and nobody was asking either of them to be anything in particular. At one point Harry said, "Why did the 4th sovereign refuse the title at first?" Fleur found the page. "Because she said she didn't want to be defined by the worst thing that had happened to her." Harry was quiet. "She accepted it eventually," Fleur added. "But she changed the terms of the designation to include a provision that the sovereign's own decisions about their bond and their future took precedence over the nation's preferences." She looked at him. "My mother had it updated when she drafted your designation. That provision is in your version." He looked at her. "She put it in before she even met me." "She read your file," Fleur said. "She said anyone who asked the question you asked deserved to have that provision in writing before the conversation started." Harry was quiet again for a moment. Then, "She's good." "She is the best," Fleur said, and there was no performance in it, no daughterly obligation. Just fact, settled and certain. What about your father? Papa is wonderful. He is also not a speaker. She tilted her head. He makes remarkable crepes and he can fix any clock you put in front of him. These are also important skills. More useful than Veela law in the morning, Harry said. Considerably. He laughed. It was a small sound, like it was new, like it was finding its shape. She had the impression it was not something he did often. Sunday morning brought Cornelius Fudge. He arrived without an appointment, old at 6 in the morning for a meeting at 10, which Apollon treated as the negotiating position it was and rescheduled to 2 in the afternoon on the grounds that she had existing commitments, which she did not, but which established immediately who was setting the terms. He was a round, anxious man in a lime-green bowler hat who entered the meeting room. Pomfrey had provided with the energy of someone who had prepared a speech and was working out which version of it to use. Madame Delacour, he said, warmly, as if they were old friends. Minister, she said, just as warmly, as if they both didn't know exactly why he was here. He sat down and arranged himself and said that of course the ministry was fully supportive of the nation's involvement in this situation, that Harry's welfare was of the utmost importance, that the Witch Weekly coverage had been irresponsible and he intended to address it, and that he hoped they could approach this collaboratively. Collaboratively, Apollon said. The boy who lived is a significant figure in the wizarding world, Fudge said. His status, his public standing, has implications far beyond any individual legal matter. We want to make sure, Minister. Apollon opened her satchel and produced a document. Set it on the table between them. This is the formal sovereign designation, registered with the nation's High Court, witnessed by 3 elders, and filed with the relevant international magical authorities as of Thursday last. It is not a proposal. It is not a starting point for negotiation. It is a completed legal process under jurisdiction that predates your ministry by several centuries. Fudge looked at the document. What I can do, Apollon continued, is tell you what it means for you, practically, if that would be helpful. Please, he said, though his jaw was tight. It means that Harry Potter cannot be compelled, pressured, or legally obligated by British ministry authority without first going through the nation's courts. It means that any attempt to manage his public image, his legal standing, or his living situation without nation approval will be treated as interference with a sovereign. It means, she looked at him steadily, that the next time someone wants to make decisions about Harry Potter's life without asking him, they will need to have a very compelling argument ready for a court that has been dealing with exactly this kind of case for 700 years and is not impressed by appeals to the greater good. Fudge's face had passed through pink and arrived somewhere approaching mauve. This is a sovereign British citizen we are discussing. The ministry has a responsibility, the ministry had a responsibility, Apollon said. For 7 years, it had a responsibility, and that responsibility involved a child with 83 illegal suppression charms in his magical core living in conditions that Healer Stroud has documented in considerable detail. She tilted her head. I look forward to discussing the ministry's record of responsibility in any court of your choosing. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man recalculating. What, Fudge said carefully, does the nation want? To protect Harry. To remove the remaining suppression charms without interference. To pursue legal accountability for those responsible. A slight pause. To operate, Minister, as we have always operated, within our own law, which has never required your permission. He left an hour later looking like a man who had come to renegotiate a lease and been told the building had already been sold. Apollon watched him go from the window of the meeting room, and Pomfrey, who had been sitting in the corner throughout and had said nothing, said, "That was beautifully done." "He'll be back," Apollon said. "With a legal team and a different approach." "You expected that?" "Of course." Apollon closed her satchel. "I've been doing this for 15 years. They always come back." She picked up her coat. "The question is whether they come back with something worth taking seriously." She glanced at the window, through which the grounds were visible, and two small figures on them, a boy and her daughter, Fleur having apparently decided that Harry needed to see the lake and Harry apparently having decided that Fleur's certainty about this made it reasonable. They were walking by the water, Fleur gesticulating with her hands in that specific way she did when she was explaining something she found genuinely important, Harry listening with that focused, full-body attention. "Your daughter is good with him," Pomfrey said. Apollon watched them for a moment. "She doesn't know what to do with people who aren't afraid of her," she said. "She finds it refreshing." "Is that what he is?" "He is 7 years old with 76 suppression charms in his core, and he asked her about the rules of Quidditch and then disagreed with her analysis of the regulations." Apollon turned from the window and picked up her satchel. "I think they'll be fine." On Sunday evening, before the Delacours took the early Monday train, Harry sat in the hospital wing with the founding charter in his lap and thought about a gold light in his palm and a woman who had told him the truth about how he might be used before she'd even said hello. He thought about a girl who had corrected library margins for 2 hours and argued about broomstick regulations and had walked with him to the lake as if it were obvious, as if he were someone whose company was just naturally worth taking. He thought about a world that had apparently been happening around him for 7 years that he had only been given the partial, dim, suppressed version of. He called the gold light. It came immediately, brighter than it had been on the first day. It sat in his palm and did not waver, and he looked at it and thought about all the versions of himself that the charms had never let him be. The designation would be formalized in a fortnight. He was not sure exactly what that meant for his life, for his future, for the complicated war-shaped destiny that Dumbledore kept alluding to in the careful way you alluded to things you decided someone else needed to navigate on your behalf. But he knew this, for the first time in his life, there were people on his side of the table who were not there because they wanted something from him, or not only because of that, and who had handed him a document that put his own choices in writing before he'd even asked. That was new. That was, Harry thought, a start. Outside, Fleur was visible on the grounds below, making her way back to the guest quarters, her silver hair catching the last of the evening light. She looked up at the hospital wing window, some instinct, or just chance, and raised one hand briefly, not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement. He raised his. The gold light went with his hand, small and steady against the dark glass. A fortnight until the designation. He could wait a fortnight. Chapter 3, Sovereign. The ceremony was nothing like Harry expected. He'd built up a picture in his head over the fortnight, something formal and ancient, stone floors and candlelight and serious-faced Veela elders watching him take some kind of oath. He'd been preparing for it the way he prepared for everything now, by reading, by asking Pomfrey questions she sometimes had to admit she didn't know the answers to, by lying awake at night and turning the shape of it over in his mind. What he got instead was a room. A good room, one of the smaller Hogwarts reception chambers, the one with east-facing windows that caught the November morning light and turned it into something warm and angular across the stone floor. Apollon had chosen it herself, he learned later, over 2 larger and more impressive options, because she'd said the ceremony wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about establishing a legal fact, and legal facts didn't require grandeur. There were 7 Veela elders present, arrived by port key from France the evening before. They were not what he'd expected either. He'd been vaguely imagining something theatrical, wings, an overwhelming beauty that turned thought to static. What he got was 7 women of varying ages who sat in a precise arc of chairs with the composed authority of people who had been making serious decisions for a very long time and were comfortable with the weight of that. One of them was so old her hair had gone from silver to something closer to white light. She watched Harry walk in with an expression he couldn't read, which bothered him less than it would have 2 months ago, because 2 months ago his instinct with unreadable expressions was to make himself smaller. That instinct was getting quieter. Apollon stood to one side, the founding charter and several additional documents on the table beside her. Pomfrey was there. Healer Stroud was there. 2 ministry observers had been permitted, not Fudge himself, who had apparently decided a direct confrontation with the nation's elders was not the opening he wanted, but a senior undersecretary named Rosalind Hopkirk and a legal representative from the Department of Magical Cooperation named Thaddeus Wren, who both sat against the far wall with the slightly strangled expressions of people told to observe and not interfere. Fleur was standing near the window. She gave Harry a look when he came in that said stop examining the room and come here, which he did, because it was clearer than anything else in the room at that moment. Nervous? She said. No, he said, and then, more accurately, a bit. You. I'm not the one becoming sovereign. You're the one who explained the ceremony to me for 3 hours on Tuesday. Yes, she agreed. So you should be perfectly prepared. He almost smiled. What if I say something wrong? You won't. How do you know? She tilted her head. Because you spent the entire train journey from London asking me about conditional clauses and formal Veela agreements, and you were more thorough than most of Bosbaden's second-year legal theory students. A slight pause. It was moderately impressive. Only moderately. Don't push it. He did actually smile this time, brief and real, and turned to face the room. The eldest of the elders, the one with the white light hair, was called Mire. She had been an elder of the Veela High Court for 40 years, which meant she had been doing this since before Harry's parents were born, and she moved and spoke with the particular quality of someone who had stopped needing to perform authority because they simply had it, settled and quiet in them like a deep current. She began in French, which Apollon translated in low, precise asides, and Harry followed well enough from the fortnight of study to catch the shape of it even where the words escaped him. The formal reading of the suppression documentation came first. Mire read it the way you read an indictment, not with heat, but with a careful, deliberate enunciation that gave every detail its full weight. 83 instances of Mate-Suppression magic. First instance placed before the subject reached 12 months of age. Final confirmed instance placed at age 5. Each instance constituting, under Article 7 of the Veela High Charter, an act of fundamental magical interference with a sovereign individual. As she read it, Harry sat very straight and listened and did not look away from her, because the alternative was to look at the ministry observers and he did not want to give them the satisfaction of seeing his face while those words were read out in this room. When Mire finished, she looked at him directly. Do you understand what has been done to you? She asked, in English, for his benefit. Yes, Harry said. And do you understand what you are being offered? Protection under Veela law. Jurisdiction. A legal standing that operates independently of the British ministry. He paused. And a provision, added by Madame Delacour, that my own decisions about my bond and my future take precedence over the nation's preferences. Something moved through Mire's expression. Approval, possibly. Or something deeper than approval, the particular recognition of someone who expected to have to fight for a thing and found it already in place. That provision, Mire said, was added because you are not a symbol or a political instrument. You are a person. The nation protects persons. She glanced at the ministry observers briefly, without heat, without emphasis, in the way someone glances at a thing they have already factored into their calculations. Does the subject Harry James Potter accept the designation of sovereign under Veela High Charter, understanding its rights, its protections, and its responsibilities? Harry had thought about this moment a great deal over the fortnight. He'd thought about whether it was the right thing, whether it was being done for the right reasons, whether he was trading one set of constraints for another. He'd asked Apollon those questions directly, and she had answered them directly, and he'd sat with the answers and tested them against his own judgment. Yes, he said. I accept. Mire produced a short crystal wand, not a standard British wand, something older and more ornate, and spoke 3 words in Veela that Apollon did not translate. She didn't need to. The effect was visible, a thin thread of light moved from Mire's wand to Harry's chest, and when it touched him it didn't flash or explode or do anything dramatic. It simply settled. Like a key into a lock that had been waiting. Harry felt it. Not like the suppression charm removals, which were relief disguised as sensation. This was different, something establishing itself, something that said here, this is yours, this is real. He put a hand flat on his own sternum without thinking about it, feeling the echo of it. Done. That was it. The legal fact, established. 7 centuries of Veela law and 7 elders and 1 morning of November light, and Harry Potter was a sovereign. The ministry observers looked like they had swallowed something that disagreed with them. What came after the ceremony was less a celebration and more a series of rapid, overlapping consequences, like a stone dropped in still water, the rings expanding outward faster than anyone could count them. By noon, the Veela nation's official press announcement had reached every major wizarding news organization in Europe. By 2, the Daily Prophet had run a special edition with the headline Potter named Veela Sovereign, what it means for wizarding Britain, and the answer they provided was mostly wrong, but the general tone of this is significant and we're not sure who to ask about it was at least accurate. By 3, Fudge had sent 3 urgent owls, escalating in tone, each one more carefully worded than the last, which indicated he'd handed them off to progressively senior members of his legal staff. Apollon handled the official correspondence with the focused efficiency of someone who had planned for this and was now executing the plan. Harry was not involved in those hours, which suited him. Pomfrey had made it clear that the ceremony was a significant magical event and that he needed rest and food and not an afternoon of international politics. He was therefore eating soup in the hospital wing at 3 in the afternoon when Dumbledore came. Not the careful, considered Dumbledore who had visited him the first time, who had chosen every word like furniture placement. This Dumbledore came in faster, and his expression was, not angry, not exactly. More like a man confronting a situation that had moved beyond his ability to redirect it, and adjusting to that fact in real time. He looked at Harry. Then at the soup. He conjured a chair and sat down, and there was a moment where he seemed to be deciding something. "Congratulations," he said. "On this morning." "Thank you," Harry said. "I mean that sincerely." "I know." Harry put his spoon down. "That's actually part of what makes it complicated." Dumbledore was quiet, which was interesting because Dumbledore was rarely quiet in a way that admitted he didn't have the next thing already prepared. "You think I mean well," Harry said. "I think you mean well. That's not the same as the things you did being all right." Dumbledore looked at him. Harry was still 7 years old, technically, still in an overlarge jumper, still eating soup in a hospital bed. He was also, irrevocably, a sovereign under Veela law, and the gold light that had been growing brighter with every removed charm was doing something low and present in the air around him, not visible to everyone, Pomfrey had told him, but felt. A warmth, a weight. "No," Dumbledore said. "It isn't the same." It was the most honest thing he'd said in Harry's presence, and Harry marked it without showing that he had. "The bond," Dumbledore said. "You understand now that it connects you to a specific person?" "Fleur Delacour," Harry said. Because he'd known since the second week, actually, had put together the way the air changed when she came in, the specific quality of attention his magic paid to her presence, the way the gold light behaved differently. He wasn't a child who needed things explained to him once he had the vocabulary for them. Dumbledore's eyebrows moved. He hadn't expected Harry to know that already. "She's 14, Harry said. "I'm 7. "We're not, it's not like that right now. We both know what it is. We're just," he thought about how to describe 2 people who found each other useful and interesting and were getting on with things in the meantime. "We're friends." "That's sensible," Dumbledore said carefully. "Are you going to try to tell me it's dangerous?" Harry asked. "Because Voldemort could use it." Dumbledore paused. "Because that's why you put the charms on me," Harry said. That was the justification. His voice was still level. The soup was getting cold and he didn't care. "So I want to know if you're going to sit here and tell me that it's still dangerous, that I should still keep it suppressed, that the greater good requires." "No," Dumbledore said. Harry waited. "I was wrong," Dumbledore said, and the words came out like they cost something significant, like they were drawn from a very deep place that didn't part with things easily. "Not about the danger is real. But about the method. About the years. About doing it without," he stopped. Started again. "You should have been told. You should have been given the choice, when you were old enough to make it. That was wrong. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The gold light did something quiet and steady. I'm not going to forgive you today, Harry said. I want you to know that. Not because I can't eventually, but because it hasn't been long enough yet and I think it would be dishonest. Dumbledore looked at him. Something in the old man's face was, very quietly and with great difficulty, rearranging itself. That seems fair, he said. The nation is going to file for formal accountability. For whoever cast the charms and whoever ordered them. Harry picked up his spoon again. I'm not going to stop that. I wouldn't ask you to. Good, Harry said, and went back to his soup. Dumbledore left. Pomfrey, who had been in her office and had heard everything through the open door because she'd been entirely unwilling to close it, appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had just watched something remarkable happen and was processing it privately. More soup, she said. Please, said Harry. Fleur found him at the lake in the late afternoon. The November air was properly cold by then, sharp enough to see your breath, and the lake surface was very still and very dark. Harry had come out after the soup and the rest and Pomfrey's reluctant agreement that fresh air was not medically contraindicated, and he'd been sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge for about 20 minutes, not thinking about much, which was rare and good. She sat down next to him without preamble and looked at the lake. How are you? She said. Fine, he said. Then, more accurately, strange. Today it was a lot. It was a significant magical event and you also had to sit through Dumbledore visiting afterward, from what Pomfrey told me. In those terms, strange is understating it. He said he was wrong, Harry said. Just, said it. No qualifications. Fleur looked at him sideways. Did you believe him? I believed he meant it. In the moment. Harry threw a small stone at the lake. It skipped once and sank. I don't know if meaning something in the moment and actually changing because of it are the same thing for him. Fleur was quiet, which was her way of agreeing with something she didn't want to just agree with outright. Your mother handled the ministry observers, Harry said. She always does. They're going to push back. Fudge. Obviously. Fleur pulled her coat tighter. He's been owling Maman since 11 this morning. She stopped reading them after the third one because they were all different versions of the same argument and none of the versions were convincing. A slight pause. He's going to try to get the international treaties re-examined. He'll argue that the sovereign designation represents foreign interference in the affairs of a British national. Will it work? No. But it will make noise for a while. She looked at the lake. Are you bothered by the noise? Harry thought about it. I don't think so. He threw another stone. This one skipped 3 times. 2 months ago I would have wanted to keep my head down and not cause trouble. He watched the ripples spread. That was the charms, partly. That instinct. Pomfrey explained it, 76 of them pressing down on your sense of scale. Of what you're allowed to take up. You start to believe the small version is you. Fleur looked at the water for a moment. When I came to Britain as a small child, she said, everyone was afraid of me. Or pretending not to be, which is worse. It makes you feel like you are something that happens to people rather than a person who simply exists. She tilted her head. I understand, in a different way, not being allowed to be your full size. Harry looked at her. She was 14 and silver-haired and more formally composed than anyone he'd met, but there was something underneath the composure that he recognized, not trauma exactly, more like the specific knowledge of someone who had learned to carry something heavy and keep walking. You don't do that with me, he said. The thing where you perform not being afraid. I'm not afraid of you. I know. A pause. Why not? She considered him with those clear, direct eyes. Because you look at people as though you're working out who they actually are, not who you've been told they are. That is not frightening. It is, she seemed to choose the word carefully, uncommon. I find it comfortable. Harry absorbed this. Most people probably find it unsettling. Most people are unsettled by attention, yes. She stood up, brushing off her coat. Come on. Maman wants to brief you before dinner on what the next 2 weeks look like. There are going to be a significant number of owls. More than 7. More than 70. Is there going to be a rule about me reading them all? There is going to be a rule about Maman's legal team reading them first and handing you only the ones that don't make her want to do something inadvisable to the British postal system. He laughed. Properly, this time, not the small testing sound from their first meeting but something more open, more real. It surprised him, the way laughing properly surprised you when you weren't used to it. Like remembering a skill. All right, he said, and followed her back toward the castle. The brief from Apollon was comprehensive and, as Fleur had predicted, dense with the implications of incoming correspondence. They sat in the guest quarters, Apollon at the table, Harry and Fleur opposite, tea going cold because nobody was remembering to drink it, and she walked him through the landscape of what the next month looked like. The formal accountability filing would be submitted to the Veela High Court within the week. It would name persons responsible for the suppression charms, and Apollon did not use Dumbledore's name but the shape of the sentence made it clear. The ministry would be formally notified. There would be a response period. There would be a hearing. Can I be there? Harry asked. At the hearing. It is your right as the sovereign, Apollon said. The question is whether it is in your interest. I want to be there. Then you will be. No argument, no gentle redirection. Just, then you will be. Harry filed that away in the growing collection of moments that felt different from most of his life, the moments where what he wanted was treated as relevant data rather than a complication. The suppression removal continues, Apollon continued. Healer Stroud has a schedule. The remaining 76 will take 3 more months at the current pace, which is appropriately cautious. As each layer comes off, your magic will continue to develop. By the time the last charm is removed, we will have a clearer picture of your full magical capacity. She looked at him steadily. I want to prepare you for the possibility that it will be significant. I know, Harry said. Significant in ways that will attract attention. Not all of it benevolent. I know that too. Apollon looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't quite maternal and wasn't quite professional, something in between, something that was possibly its own category. Are you afraid? She asked, and it was a genuine question, not a test. Harry thought about it honestly, the way he'd been learning to think about things honestly rather than giving the answer that made people comfortable. Of the attention, he said. No. Of getting things wrong? Yeah, a bit. He looked at his hands on the table. I've been making decisions for myself for about 2 months. Most of my life, decisions were just made around me. I'm still working out if my judgment is good. It is, Fleur said, from beside him. He glanced at her. You've known me for 2 months. Yes, and in that time you've asked better questions than most adults in this situation would, identified the political motivations of every person who has sat across from you, and correctly assessed the dynamic between my mother and Dumbledore without being told anything about their history. She shrugged. Your judgment is good. Accept it. Apollon looked at her daughter with an expression that she smoothed away before it became visible, but Harry caught the edge of it, pride, warm and specific. There is one more thing, Apollon said. She opened a different folder. There has been contact from a private individual. Not the ministry, not any official body. A man named Nicholas Flamel. Harry's head came up. He'd read enough in the past 2 months to know the name. The alchemist? The same. He is 660 years old, which makes him, among other things, one of the few living people with direct memory of the original Veela sovereign treaty. She slid a letter across the table. He would like to meet you. Harry took the letter. The handwriting was very old-fashioned, not illegible, just the handwriting of someone who had learned to write in a different century and never updated the style. It was brief. It said that he had been watching the situation with interest, that he had some information about the original sovereign protections that he believed was relevant, and that he was available at Harry's convenience. It also said, at the end, in a line that sat separate from the rest, "I knew your family. I knew what was done. I am sorry it took this long for someone to look." Harry read that line 3 times. "I want to meet him," he said. "I thought you might," Apollon said. "I'll arrange it." That evening, the elders held a private dinner in the reception chamber, and Harry was seated between Mire and a younger elder named Sylvie who had bright, dark eyes and a tendency to ask sideways questions disguised as observations. Fleur was across the table and occasionally caught his eye when Sylvie said something particularly interesting and gave a look that meant "I'll explain the full context later." Mire, Harry discovered, was in possession of a devastating dry wit and had absolutely no patience for political euphemism, which made her the most enjoyable dinner companion he had experienced in his admittedly limited social history. She told him about the third sovereign, a young man, the only male sovereign before Harry, who had arrived at his designation hearing and immediately asked the presiding elder to explain the part of the charter that he found philosophically inconsistent with the nation's stated position on individual magical autonomy. The elder in question had been so startled that she had answered him honestly, and the resulting 3-hour conversation had produced 2 amendments to the charter that were still in place. "What happened to him?" Harry asked. "He became a very effective advocate for Veela rights in the Mediterranean territories," Mire said. "He was infuriating and extremely useful." She looked at Harry over her wine glass. He had pumpkin juice, but nobody made a thing of it. "You remind me of him." "Is that a compliment?" "I just said he was infuriating and extremely useful," she said. "You decide." Down the table, Fleur made a sound that was very precisely not a laugh. After dinner, when the elders had retired and Apollon was in deep consultation with 2 of them about the accountability filing, Harry and Fleur stood in the corridor outside the reception chamber. The castle had gone quiet around them, the deep nighttime quiet of a school where most of the children were dormitories away. "Mire likes you," Fleur said. "She said I was infuriating." From Mire, that is the highest available compliment. Fleur leaned against the stone wall, arms crossed, looking at him with that particular evaluating quality she had. "How are you really?" "Not the answer you gave Maman." Harry leaned against the opposite wall. "Honest question." "I don't ask other kinds." "I feel like I'm building something," he said. "But I don't know what the blueprint looks like yet. I know what I want it to not be. I know I don't want to be managed, or protected in a way that's just a prettier kind of controlled, or turned into a story someone else is telling." He looked at the flagstones. "But what I actually want it to be, I'm still working on that." Fleur was quiet for a moment. "That is more honest than most adults would be." "You asked." "I know." She pushed off the wall. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you've built so far, in 2 months, with 76 charms still on, at 7 years old, it's already more than most people manage." She tilted her head. "Just so you have the data." She walked away down the corridor, silver hair catching the candlelight, and Harry watched her go and thought about blueprints and buildings and the feeling of a legal designation settling into his chest like a key into a waiting lock. Sovereign. His. Not small. Not managed. Not afraid. The gold light in his palm could have lit the whole corridor if he'd wanted it to. He kept it gentle, kept it warm, and let it go out when he turned for the hospital wing. He had 76 charms left to remove. He had a hearing to prepare for. He had a 600-year-old alchemist to meet. He was, for the first time in his life, looking forward to all of it. In the headmaster's office, Albus Dumbledore sat alone with Fawkes and the weight of a conversation he hadn't expected, and looked at a portrait on his wall, a previous headmaster, long dead, that looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who had seen this kind of reckoning before and knew there was no shortcut through it. "You made a mistake," the portrait said. Yes, Dumbledore said. Several of them. Over many years. Yes. And now? Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. Outside his window, the November night pressed against the glass, cold and clear and not interested in offering him comfort. Now, he said, I think I wait. And I try to be useful rather than directive. He paused. It is not a posture I am accustomed to. The portrait made the sound of someone who had expected exactly that answer and found it insufficient. Fawkes sang 3 low notes and went back to sleep. Chapter 4, What the charms were hiding. The 42nd charm came off on a Wednesday in late January, and Harry set a table on fire. Not dramatically. Not explosively. The table simply caught, a clean blue flame that ran along the grain of the wood the way fire ran along paper, fast, purposeful, as though the wood had been waiting for a reason. Healer Stroud had the suppressant charm up before the table got past scorched, and she stood there looking at it with her hands on her hips and the expression of someone revising their estimate significantly upward. Sorry, Harry said. Don't apologize for your magic, Stroud said. Apologize for not warning me you were feeling something shift. She pulled out her notebook and made several notations in the cramped, rapid handwriting she used when something was genuinely interesting. What did it feel like? Like a cable snapping, Harry said. Not painful. More like, tension you didn't know was there, and then it's just gone. Stroud wrote that down. Pomfrey, from the doorway, was doing the thing where she pretended to be busy with something else while listening intently. The 42nd is a pivot point, Stroud said. The charms were laid in a specific architecture, the outer layers handled the bond suppression, but starting around the 50th, they began doing something else as well. Suppressing magical output more broadly. Not just the bond, general power. So the inner ones aren't just about Fleur, Harry said. No. Stroud looked at him steadily. The outer ones were about the bond. The inner ones were about making sure you couldn't do anything about it. She closed her notebook. Whoever designed this structure was not just trying to suppress a mate bond. They were designing a ceiling. Harry sat with that for a moment. How high is the ceiling? We won't know until the last one is off. Stroud picked up her bag. But the table suggests it's higher than I initially projected. After she left, Harry looked at the scorched table for a while. Pomfrey replaced it with a quiet flick of her wand and sat down. You knew the inner ones were different, Harry said. It wasn't a question. Healer Stroud informed me when she identified the architectural pattern, Pomfrey said. 3 weeks ago. You didn't tell me. No. She met his gaze. Because I didn't want you going into the sessions with a preconceived idea about what was going to happen. I wanted your genuine responses, not responses shaped by expectation. A pause. Was that wrong? Harry thought about it honestly. A little, he said. But I understand why. He looked at his hands. Is it going to get more dramatic? The releases? Almost certainly. How dramatic? Pomfrey was quiet for a moment in the specific way she was quiet when she was deciding how honest to be. We don't have a reference point, she said. Nobody has removed 83 suppression charms from a magical core with your particular signature. Stroud is the best there is and she's working carefully, but, we're in unmapped territory. So anything could happen. Yes. Harry nodded. He'd spent 3 months now learning to sit with uncertainty without it becoming fear. It was a skill, he'd decided, like any other, and it got easier with practice. He looked at the spot where the table had been and thought about ceilings and about the version of himself that had been locked underneath 42 layers of someone else's intent. All right, he said. Then we keep going. Apollon arrived back from Paris on Thursday with the formal accountability filing in one hand and news in the other. The filing was, as she explained in clipped, precise terms, complete. It named Albus Dumbledore as the primary architect of the suppression scheme. It named Petunia Dursley as an accessory, specifically regarding the home visits and her knowledge. It was registered with the Veela High Court and with 3 international magical bodies, and it had been delivered to Dumbledore's official address that morning by a nation courier who had described the headmaster's expression upon receipt as controlled, but not entirely. The news was fudge. "He's found a sympathetic Wisengamot member," Apollon said, dropping into the chair opposite Harry with the ease of someone who was comfortable enough with him now to skip the formal settling in. "A man named Ragnald Peel. Old family. Strong opinions about the primacy of British magical sovereignty." "What's Peel going to do?" Harry said. "He's going to introduce a motion to have the sovereign designation reviewed under British law, on the grounds that the Veela Treaty's application to a British citizen is constitutionally irregular." "Can he do that?" "He can introduce the motion," Apollon said. "He cannot succeed with it. But the process will take time and generate noise and create the impression, for anyone not paying close attention, that the designation is contested." She looked at him. "Fudge's strategy is optics, not law. He can't beat us in court. He wants the public to think there's a legitimate dispute. So we make the public think there isn't." Apollon paused. "How would you propose to do that?" Harry thought about it. He'd been reading, not just Veela law and magical history, but the Daily Prophet, the coverage of the sovereign announcement, the letters to the editor, the way the story was being shaped. He had a feel, now, for how public narrative worked, or at least for how it was being manipulated around him. "An interview," he said. "With me. Not a press release, not a statement from your office. Me, directly." Apollon was quiet. "I know I'm 7, Harry said, before she could say it. But that's actually part of the point. Fudge is trying to make this abstract, a legal dispute about treaties and constitutionality. If I'm visible, it's not abstract anymore. It's a 7-year-old who had 83 illegal charms in his magic since before he could walk." He met her gaze. "Which is the truth? And which is significantly harder to mount a PR campaign against?" Apollon looked at him for a long moment. He noticed she did this, gave things time before she responded, not stalling but actually thinking, which was rare enough in adults to be worth noting. "The Prophet is not trustworthy," she said. "Not the Prophet. European magical press, they've been covering the sovereign announcement with more accuracy. And we'd have approval of the final text before publication." Apollon made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since Fudge's second owl," Harry said. "The one where he started using the phrase, appropriate oversight." She opened her satchel and pulled out a pen and began writing. "I'll contact their Paris correspondent. She's thorough and she's fair." A pause. "Fleur will want to be present for the interview." "I know," Harry said. "That's fine. She won't interfere." "I know that too." Apollon looked up. "You two have been corresponding." It wasn't quite a question. Harry didn't confirm or deny it, which was, he was learning, sometimes the most useful answer. They had been corresponding. After the Delacours returned to France, Fleur had sent a letter in the second week, brief, practical, containing a corrected version of an annotation she'd been thinking about from the nation's founding charter and believed she'd gotten wrong when she'd explained it to him at Hogwarts. He'd written back that her correction was partially correct but she'd overcorrected in the other direction, and cited the relevant passage. She'd written back 3 days later with a longer response that included a diagram. The letters were mostly about Veela law and magical theory. Occasionally they were about other things. She was at Beauxbatons, working on her OWL equivalents 2 years early because her professors had decided her testing ahead was less disruptive than having her sit through material she'd already mastered. She found this mildly satisfying and mostly annoying, she wrote, because testing early meant being visible in a way that attracted a specific kind of attention she'd rather not have. "People who are afraid of you," Harry had written back, "are going to be afraid regardless of what you do. You might as well be doing something interesting while they're afraid." There had been a pause in the correspondence after that, for days, and then a letter that was shorter than usual and said, simply, "That is a very annoying observation because it is correct. Thank you." He kept the letters in the drawer of his hospital bedside table, under his books. The 45th charm came off on a Monday morning and made all the windows in the hospital wing rattle in their frames. Not break. Just rattle, one clear resonant vibration that went through the glass and the stone and probably several floors of the castle above, like a struck bell. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then it was over. Harry opened his eyes, he'd had them closed during the session, and looked at the windows and said, "Was that me?" "That was absolutely you," Stroud said. She was writing very quickly. "How loudly did it happen?" "Loudly enough that we're going to have an inquiry from Dumbledore within the hour." Dumbledore's inquiry arrived in 17 minutes, which was faster than an hour, but Pomfrey handled him at the door and Harry heard the conversation from the ward, a routine side effect, Albus, nothing concerning, yes we're maintaining the schedule, and the headmaster left without coming in, which Harry appreciated, because the 45th had left him feeling scraped open in a particular way that would have made conversation difficult. The scraping open feeling was what he'd been trying to articulate to Stroud for several sessions. Each charm that came off didn't just release magic. It released context, fragments of sensation, emotional residue, things that had been locked in with the suppression and were now coming loose. After the 38th he'd had an hour of inexplicable grief that wasn't about anything in particular. After the 40th, something that felt almost like rage before it settled. After the 45th, sitting in the hospital wing with the windows still faintly trembling in memory, he felt something large and shapeless that took him a while to identify. It was the feeling of having been wronged. Specifically, clearly, factually wronged. Not abstract. Not complicated by other emotions. Just, this happened to me and it was wrong, and I am here on the other side of it, and the person responsible is somewhere in this castle. He sat with it and didn't try to flatten it or reason around it. Pomfrey came in and gave him tea and did not try to make it better with words, which was exactly right. After a while, Harry said, "I want to write to Flamel." About the meeting? About the original sovereign protections. Apollon mentioned he has information about them, something beyond what's in the public record. He wrapped his hands around the mug. "I want to know what the protections were designed for originally. Not just what they do now. What they were for." Pomfrey found him parchment. He wrote the letter that evening, precise and direct, 3 paragraphs. He explained what he was looking for and why, and said that he understood if some of the historical information was sensitive, and that he was not asking for anything that would compromise Flamel's privacy or position. He sealed it and sent it with Pomfrey's owl. A response came in 2 days. It was the longest letter he'd ever received, 12 pages, close-written, in that old-fashioned handwriting, and it began, "You write like someone who has been thinking for much longer than 7 years. This is not a complaint." Harry read it 3 times. The Peel motion was introduced to the Wisengamot on a Thursday, and by Friday it was in every newspaper in Britain, and by Saturday Harry had read 14 different opinions about it, most of which were wrong in interesting ways. He was in the middle of drafting his response to the interview request. Apollon's Paris correspondent, a sharp woman named Celeste Marine, had sent a list of questions that Harry was reviewing with the focus he gave to Veela legal texts, when someone knocked on the hospital wing door and came in without waiting for an answer. Not Pomfrey. Not Dumbledore. Not anyone Harry had been expecting. The boy was about 10, stocky, sandy-haired, wearing Hufflepuff robes with the slightly startled expression of someone who had done a brave thing before fully thinking it through. He stood in the doorway looking at Harry and then at the hospital wing as if he'd expected something more dramatic. "You're Harry Potter," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "I'm Cedric Diggory," the boy said. "I'm a second year." A pause. "I read about the sovereign thing in the Prophet. My dad thinks he thinks Fudge is being an idiot. I told him I'd say that to you directly if I ever met you, and then it turned out you were just in the hospital wing so." He stopped. "Hello." Harry looked at him for a moment. Hello. Cedric seemed to decide the hard part was over and came in properly. I wasn't going to bother you. I just wanted to. He seemed to search for what exactly he'd wanted to do. Say that some people at Hogwarts are on your side. Without being asked. Without it being political. He shrugged, slightly self-conscious. Some of the older students are being idiots about it. Saying the Veela are trying to take over British wizarding governance. I've been arguing with them. How's that going? Harry said. Mixed results, Cedric admitted. Some of them are very committed to being wrong. Harry almost smiled. What does your father do? He works for the ministry, actually. Magical games and sports. Which is how I know fudge is, how I know the current political situation is complicated by people acting in their own interest rather than anyone else's. He'd clearly been coached in diplomatic phrasing at some point and occasionally it showed. Anyway. I wanted to say. Harry set down Celeste's questions. Sit down if you want. Cedric sat, with the slightly surprised expression of someone who had expected to be dismissed. They talked for an hour. It was the most normal conversation Harry had had in months. Cedric wanted to know what it was like to grow up not knowing about magic, Harry wanted to know what Hogwarts classes were like, and they both ended up talking about Quidditch for longer than Harry would have expected given that he'd never played it, because Cedric explained it with genuine enthusiasm and Harry found himself actually interested. You should try it, Cedric said. When you start here properly. I might, Harry said. He thought about Fleur saying you would be very good at it and felt something warm and settled. I might. After Cedric left, Pomfrey appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been listening from her office again. He's a good kid, Harry said. He is, Pomfrey agreed. His father is less reliable but his intentions are good. She came in and straightened the papers on Harry's bedside table that Cedric's presence had slightly disordered. You were comfortable with him. He wasn't asking for anything, Harry said simply. He was just, there. Because he wanted to be. He looked at the door Cedric had gone out through. That's not something I have a lot of experience with. Pomfrey was quiet for a moment. You're going to have more of it, she said. As the charms come off. She sat in the chair by his bed. The sovereign designation changes how people see you, but it also changes, or it will, as your magic becomes fully itself, how they respond to your presence. The mate bond energy, even at this early stage, even incompletely realized, carries something. A quality. She chose words carefully. People will want to be near you. Not in a manipulative way. Just, drawn. It happens with Veela, and you carry something adjacent to that. Because of Fleur. Harry said. Because of what you are. Which the bond makes more apparent. She looked at him. I want you to be aware of it. So you can distinguish between people who are genuinely themselves around you and people who are responding to something they can't explain and mistaking it for their own free will. Harry thought about Cedric's clear-eyed, slightly self-conscious directness. I think I can already tell the difference. I think you can too, Pomfrey said. I'm just making sure you know you're doing it. The interview with Celeste Marine happened in the second week of February. She was a small, brown-haired woman with a quick intelligence and the particular energy of someone who had learned that the best interviews happened when the subject forgot they were being interviewed. She had a quick quotes quill that she kept capped until Harry explicitly said she could use it, which he appreciated. They sat in the small reception chamber, not the ceremony room, a different one, less formal, better light. Apollon was present. Fleur, who had come with her mother for a scheduled removal session and stayed because the timing aligned, sat in the far corner with a book she was not reading. Before we start formally, Celeste said, I want to tell you what I intend to write. Not to get your approval, the editorial position is mine, but because I think you should know. Go ahead, Harry said. I'm going to write about what happened to you as a specific, named instance of institutional failure. Not about Dumbledore as a villain, though the accountability filing speaks for itself, but about the system. About how someone with sufficient authority and sufficient belief in their own judgment can do something like this to a child and have it go unchecked for 7 years. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to write about the fact that the only reason it stopped was because a healer did her job properly and a foreign nation had laws strong enough to act on what she found. Because the British ministry, which was supposed to protect you, was either complicit or negligent. A pause. Is that fair? Yes, Harry said. Good. She uncapped the quill. Tell me what it felt like. The first day, when Madame Pomfrey told you what she'd found. Harry thought back to it, the examination table, the overlarge jumper, the thread he'd been winding around his finger, the gold diagnostic lattice above him. The particular quality of that afternoon, which was something he carried with him as a reference point, the before, and the after. Like being told a room was bigger than you thought, he said. Not just your room, the whole building. And realizing you'd been living in one corner of it because someone had convinced you that was the whole thing. Celeste's quill moved. Were you angry? Not at first. First I was curious, mostly. I wanted to understand it. He paused. The anger came later. It's more useful later. When you actually know what to do with it. What are you doing with it now? This, he said simply. The sovereign designation. The sovereign designation, the accountability filing, the interview. Making the thing visible and making it accurate. He held her gaze. Fudge wants people to think this is about Veela politics. It's not. It's about what happened to me and whether the people responsible face consequences. He tilted his head. That's not complicated. What do you want from the accountability process? Celeste asked. The truth in a formal record. Not revenge, I'm not particularly interested in revenge. He thought of Dumbledore, genuinely, and tried to be honest with himself about it. I want it documented. I want it to be impossible, after this, for anyone to do this to another child and not have it treated as the serious crime it is. Not the exception. Not the justified because I'm special. He paused. There are other children who have had suppression charms put on them without consent. Fewer than me, I'd hope. But they exist. They deserve the same legal mechanism I have. Celeste looked up from her notes. For a moment she wasn't interviewing him, she was just a person listening to a 7-year-old say something that most adults wouldn't have thought to say. You're already thinking about other people, she said. I'm thinking about what happens after me, Harry said. The designation protects me. But it should protect anyone this happens to. He looked at his hands on the table. The gold light was present, low and steady, not showing off. That's what it's for. Not just me. The whole point of making this visible is so it can't be hidden again. Fleur, in the corner, was very still with her unread book. Apollin's pen moved quietly over her legal pad. Celeste capped her quill. Opened it again. Then she said, with a directness that matched his, one more question. Off the record, if you want. Go ahead. Are you afraid of what's coming? The hearing. Voldemort, eventually. All of it. Harry considered it. Genuinely, honestly, without performing either bravery or vulnerability. No, he said finally. I've been afraid for most of my life and I didn't even know it. The charms created a kind of background anxiety that was just always there. And now they're coming off. He looked at his hand, at the gold light sitting quietly in his palm. And the thing underneath the fear is, it's not more fear. It's just me. A pause. And I find I can work with that. The 51st charm came off on a Friday evening in early March, and Harry didn't set anything on fire or rattle any windows. What happened was quieter and larger. Stroud cast, the charm released, and Harry sat in the stillness afterward and felt something like a door opening, not outward, not dramatically, but inward, into a space he hadn't known existed. A depth to his own magic that had simply not been there before, that had been pressed down and down under 51 layers of someone else's fear and certainty, and was now rising like groundwater. He looked at his hand. The gold light came, and it was not the small careful flame it had been in November. It rose from his palm like a small sun, warm and clean and genuinely bright, casting proper light across the ward, making the windows glow amber. Stroud sat very still and looked at it. "Harry," she said. "I know," he said. "This is." She stopped. Started again. "This is significant." "I know. 32 more to go, and it's already," she stopped again, which was unusual for Stroud, who was not generally someone who ran out of words. "I know," Harry said, for the third time, because he did know. He could feel what 32 more would mean, not the ceiling exactly, but the direction of it, the scale. He understood what Pomfrey had been carefully not saying for weeks. He kept the light steady in his hand and looked at it with something that was neither fear nor arrogance but a kind of clear, settled acknowledgement. This was his. It had always been his. 51 layers of someone else's decision-making, and it had been here, waiting, patient as groundwater. "Does it feel all right?" Stroud asked. "Yes," Harry said. And then, because it was true and because this was Stroud, who deserved honest reporting, "It feels extraordinary." He let the light grow until it filled the room, warm and gold and absolutely his, and Pomfrey in the doorway put her hand over her mouth for just a moment and then composed herself because she was a professional, and Stroud wrote 6 rapid pages of notes, and outside the castle the March evening was dark and cold and entirely unaware that something had just shifted in a hospital wing that would eventually be felt much, much further than Surrey. Fudge's legal team filed their first formal objection on a Monday. Harry read the summary Apollon sent him. Set it down. Picked up his response to Flamel's 12-page letter, which he'd been working on for 2 weeks because it deserved 2 weeks. Added a paragraph at the end. Flamel writes that the original sovereign protections were designed not just to protect the individual but to establish a precedent. That the point was never one child, the point was the law. I think about that a lot. The ministry wants to make this small again. They want to make it about technicalities and treaties and constitutional irregularities. But it isn't small. It was never small. I had 83 charms designed to keep me manageable, and the more they come off, the less manageable I become, and I find that I think that's the point. He sealed the letter and gave it to Pomfrey's owl and watched it fly out into the March night, toward Geneva, toward a man who had been alive long enough to watch history turn and had chosen, this time, to put his hand on the wheel. 32 more to go. He was ready. Chapter 5, The Trial of Albus Dumbledore. Nicholas Flamel arrived in April on a Thursday morning, and he looked nothing like Harry expected. Harry had built a picture from the letters, something ancient and deliberate, a man carrying 6 centuries the way mountains carried weather, heavy and obvious. What stepped through the Hogwarts floor was a slight, sharp-eyed man who moved with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped caring whether his body cooperated and had simply decided it would. His hair was white and close-cropped. His hands were ink-stained. He looked at Harry with the direct, assessing quality of someone who had met a very large number of people over a very long time and was not easily impressed by any of them. "You're smaller than your letter suggested," Flamel said, by way of introduction. "You're more normal-looking," Harry said. Flamel considered this. "Fair," he said, and sat down. They had the small reception chamber again. Pomfrey had claimed it for Harry's use so consistently over the past months that it had quietly become his room in all but designation. The fire was going. Tea was on the table. Apollon was present, to Harry's left, with her legal pad and her pen. Fleur had come down for the weekend, and was in the chair to Harry's right with her arms crossed and the specific focused attention she brought to things she considered important. Flamel looked at the room, at the configuration of it, at Harry in the center, and something in his expression made a small, private adjustment. "Your letters," Flamel said, settling back. "You asked about the original sovereign protections. Not what they do, what they were for." "Yes," Harry said. "Most people who ask about the protections want the legal mechanics. Rights, jurisdictions, procedural flows." Flamel poured himself tea without being invited, which Harry noted was the gesture of someone entirely comfortable in any space they entered. "You wanted the philosophy. Why?" "Because the mechanics can be argued around," Harry said. "Legal structures can be challenged and reinterpreted and subjected to Wiesengemot motions and Fudge's legal team finding constitutional irregularities. But if I understand why the protections were built, I understand what they're actually defending, and that's harder to argue around." Flamel looked at Apollon. "He's correct." "I'm aware," Apollon said, and there was warmth in it. "The original sovereign protections," Flamel said, turning back to Harry, "were built in 1326 by a Veela elder named Cassia Vorn in response to a specific case and a general principle. The specific case was what I described in my letter, the young man suppressed by his father for political convenience. The general principle," he set down his cup. "The general principle was this: magic is not a tool. It is not a resource to be managed, rationed, or contained for someone else's benefit. It is a fundamental aspect of a person's identity. Interfering with it is not like stealing property. It is not even like physical assault. It is closer to," Cassia's phrase was identity murder. "The killing of a self that has not yet been allowed to fully exist." The fire crackled. Nobody said anything. Cassia's argument to the founding council was that the wizarding world had no legal concept for this crime because the wizarding world had a long and comfortable tradition of treating powerful people's convenience as a legitimate justification for almost anything. Flamel's voice was dry, the dryness of someone reporting facts they had watched remain true for 6 centuries and were still tired of. She argued that without a specific, severe, internationally recognized law, the crime would continue to be committed by people who believed their reasons were good enough. And she was right. She spent 40 years making sure it became law. "And the sovereign designation was the penalty structure," Harry said. "Partly. But Cassia's deeper argument was that the designation was not primarily punitive. It was corrective. The sovereign is recognized not because they are a victim, though they are, but because the recognition itself is the remedy. You cannot simply remove the charms and call it done. The public, legal, formal recognition that the person exists in their full magical identity, and that their full magical identity is protected, is part of the healing." He looked at Harry steadily. "The recognition says, you were made small, and here is the world acknowledging that you should never have been, and here is the law placing itself between you and anyone who tries to do it again." Harry was quiet for a moment. "What happened to Cassia?" he said. "She lived to be 112, which is unremarkable by Veela standards, and spent the last 40 years of her life traveling between magical nations arguing for the adoption of her framework." A slight pause. "She was largely successful. She was also, by all accounts, extremely difficult to be in a room with unless you enjoyed being comprehensively out-argued." He tilted his head. "She and I met once, in 1401. She was 90. She told me my work on transmutation was technically impressive and philosophically shallow." "Was she right?" Fleur asked, from her chair. "Almost certainly," Flamel said, without particular distress. Harry looked at the fire for a moment, turning the shape of what Flamel had said. "Identity murder. The killing of a self that has not yet been allowed to fully exist." He thought about the version of himself that had walked through the Dursleys' door on examination day, small, watchful, winding a thread around his finger. Whether that was him or a shaped absence of him. "You said in your letter you knew my family," Harry said. Flamel looked at him. Not the sharp, assessing look of their first exchange, something quieter. "I knew your mother," he said. "Lily Evans, before she was Potter. She came to me in her 6th year, having read about my work through channels that would have impressed most graduated healers. She wanted to understand the intersection of alchemical theory and magical core development. A pause. She was brilliant. More than that, she was precise. She understood that brilliance without precision was just noise, and she had the discipline to be both. What was she like? Harry asked. The question that always came out before he could decide whether to ask it. Fierce, Flamel said simply. She had a quality of attention that made everything she looked at feel seen. And she was not remotely interested in what she was supposed to think. She formed her own positions and she defended them until you showed her a better argument, and then she adopted the better argument without ego. He looked at Harry. You have her eyes. And, from your letters, a significant amount of her mind. The fire. The tea going slightly cold. Apollin's pen, which had stopped moving. She would have been, Flamel said quietly, devastatingly angry about what was done to you. I know, Harry said. Someone told me that before. It bears repeating. The hearing date was set for the second week of May. Not a British Wisingamot proceeding, the accountability filing sat with the Veela High Court, which had its own chambers, its own procedures, its own version of impartiality that did not require the approval of Cornelius Fudge. The hearing would take place in Edinburgh, at the International Magical Conclave building, which was neutral ground by treaty and had been hosting Veela High Court sessions on British soil since 1743. Apollin had offered Harry the option of providing written testimony rather than appearing in person. No, he'd said immediately. It will be intense, she'd said. The defense will have representation. They will be permitted to question you. I know. You're 8 years old, Harry. He'd had his birthday in March, quietly, which Pomfrey had marked with a proper birthday cake and Stroud had marked by removing 3 additional charms as a gift, which was the most Stroud-specific birthday present imaginable. Fleur had sent a book, Theoretical Ward Construction, Advanced Level, with a note that said, You will be ready for this sooner than you think. I know how old I am, he'd said to Apollin. I want to be there. She'd looked at him for a long moment and then written confirmed, in-person testimony on her legal pad. In the weeks before the hearing, Apollin prepared him the way she prepared everything, thoroughly, without softening the edges. She told him what the chamber looked like, how it was arranged, who would be present. She told him that Dumbledore would have representation, a highly respected legal advocate named Gideon Fairchild, who had never lost a case in a British court and had lost 3 cases internationally, all to Apollin. Is that a coincidence? Harry said. No, Apollin said. Fairchild knows my case law. He'll be looking for weaknesses in the documentation, inconsistencies in the timeline. He's intelligent and he's thorough and his strategy will be, she considered. His strategy will be to establish that the charms were placed with protective intent, that they were the least harmful option available given the circumstances, and that the ongoing renewals were a response to genuine threat rather than a desire to control. And that's wrong because intent does not constitute defense under Veela High Charter law. Kasha Vorn specifically wrote out intent as a mitigating factor in cases of this severity. It does not matter, legally, whether Dumbledore believed he was helping you. She held his gaze. What matters is what was done, how long it was done for, and what it cost you. What will they ask me? Harry said. Fairchild will try to establish that you are too young to fully understand the political and magical context. That your testimony reflects healer influence, or nation influence, rather than your own perspective. He may suggest that your relationship with Fleur represents a conflict of interest in how the bond suppression has been characterized. Harry thought about this. What should I do when he tries those things? Answer honestly, Apollin said. Don't argue. Don't perform. You are not here to win a debate with Gideon Fairchild, you are here to tell the truth about your experience, clearly and directly, and let the documentation do the structural work. She paused. If he tries to suggest that your testimony is influenced, ask him to specify the influence. Make him name it precisely. He will not be able to, because the documentation of your responses predates your contact with the nation. Pomfrey's records, Harry said. Pomfrey's records go back to the morning of the examination. They predate me, predate Healer Stroud's involvement, predate any contact with the nation. They are the cleanliest possible evidence because they were created by a healer doing her job with no knowledge of what she would find. A slight pause. Pomfrey is also testifying. I know. He thought of Pomfrey, her professional steadiness, the way she'd locked her office door when the diagnostic came back wrong and then gone back to him without panicking. She'll be good. She will be formidable, Apollon said. She has 31 years of documented casework and she is constitutionally incapable of saying anything other than exactly what she believes to be true. Flamel was also testifying. His contribution was historical, the original sovereign protections, the legal philosophy, the 7th century context. He had testified before the Veela High Court in 1887 and appeared entirely unimpressed by the prospect of doing it again. Do you get nervous? Harry had asked him, during one of their afternoon sessions. No, Flamel had said. I stopped getting nervous about things people might think of me sometime around 1450. It takes considerable energy to maintain concern about others' opinions, and I had better uses for the energy. What about things that actually matter? Harry said. Things that aren't about what people think. Flamel had looked at him. Yes. Occasionally. He'd paused. This matters. So yes. Dumbledore came to see Harry 4 days before the hearing. He knocked this time, which was different from before. Harry called "Come in," and the headmaster entered and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, and Harry understood that this was a different Dumbledore from the one who had sat across from him in October, not broken, not collapsed, but altered. Working through something. A man who was, slowly and with enormous difficulty, revising a foundational belief. I'm not going to ask you to change your testimony, Dumbledore said, which Harry respected because it suggested he already knew that asking would be pointless, and acknowledging that suggested a better understanding of Harry than he'd had 6 months ago. Good, Harry said. I am going to say, Dumbledore paused. The pause was real, not rhetorical. I am going to say that I understand the process better now than I did when I chose the actions I chose. I understood the Veela bond. I understood the suppression mechanics. What I did not understand, he stopped again. What I failed to understand was that I was not protecting a future, I was interfering with a person. And those are not the same thing. Harry looked at him. When did you work that out? Gradually, Dumbledore said. Over the past several months. There was no single moment. He looked at Harry with clear, tired eyes. You have conducted yourself throughout this process with more clarity and more integrity than most adults I have known. I want you to know that I see that. Regardless of what happens at the hearing. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about Kasha Vorn and identity murder and the space between intent and impact. He thought about his mother, fierce and precise, who would have been devastatingly angry and who had, according to Flamel, formed her own positions and defended them until she found a better argument and then adopted it without ego. I believe you mean that, Harry said. And I want you to know, I'm not doing this to destroy you. I'm doing this because it needs to be on the record. Formally. Permanently. He held Dumbledore's gaze. What you did was wrong and it needs to be in the record as wrong, so that the next person who decides they're wise enough to make choices like this for someone else without asking has to think about it. A pause. That's more important than anything that happens to you specifically. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You are, he said, extraordinarily like your mother. So people keep saying, Harry said. Edinburgh in May was cold and grey and smelled like rain and stone, and the International Magical Conclave building sat on a hill south of the city with the self-possessed solidity of architecture that had been built to last and knew it. Harry arrived with Apollon and Fleur and Pomfrey and Flamel, the 5 of them coming through the international Fleur network into a high-ceilinged receiving hall with flagstone floors and tall windows. Fleur was wearing formal Beauxbatons robes, dark blue, precise, and carrying herself with the quality she deployed when she was in territory she intended to hold. She fell into step beside Harry as they moved toward the chamber corridor. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Not performing it. Just true." "Fairchild will try the age argument first," she said. "Maman thinks he'll open with it." "I know. When he does, don't look annoyed. It's what he wants." "I know that too." She looked at him sideways. "I'm not telling you things you don't know." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because it helps me to say them." A pause. "I find I'm more nervous than you are." Harry looked at her. "You don't have to be." "I know I don't have to be," she said, with a slight edge. "That is not how being nervous works." He almost smiled. "You're allowed to be nervous. I'm just saying it'll be all right." She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She nodded, once, and straightened her robes, and they walked into the chamber. The Veela High Court chamber was not large. Harry had been expecting something vast and imposing, high ceilings, ranks of observers, the weight of institutional authority made physical. What he found instead was a room that sat perhaps 50 people, stone-walled, lit by a combination of tall windows and steady magical light that had no visible source. The elder bench was 5 chairs on a raised platform, Mireille in the center, 4 others ranged around her. The floor of the chamber was divided by a long central table, respondent side and petitioner side, and the air had the specific quality of a room where serious things were regularly decided. Dumbledore was already seated on the respondent's side with his legal representative, Gideon Fairchild. Fairchild was a tall, silver-haired man with a precisely tailored expression, not cold, just controlled. He looked at Harry when Harry came in, a brief professional assessment, and Harry looked back without dropping his gaze or modifying it, and Fairchild returned to his notes. Dumbledore looked at Harry once. Harry gave him a nod, not warm, not hostile, just present, and took his seat. The gallery held ministry observers, journalists who had been granted limited access, several Wisingamot members who had come under the guise of official interest, and, in the back row, Cedric Diggory's father, Amos, who had apparently taken a personal day and would not be making eye contact with the ministry observers. Mireille called the chamber to order. The opening statements were formal and largely procedural. Apollon established the petition, the timeline, the documentation. Fairchild established Dumbledore's position, that the charms were protective in intent, placed against a genuine dark threat, renewed as necessary precaution, and that the designation of illegal magical interference failed to account for the exceptional circumstances of a child marked by one of the darkest wizards in recent history. Mireille listened to all of it with the attentiveness of someone who had heard both arguments in various forms many times before and was waiting for the part that was new. Pomfrey testified first. She was, as Apollon had predicted, formidable. She had her original diagnostic records, her notes from every session, Stroud's case documentation, the timeline of the renewal visits as reported by Petunia Desley. She delivered all of it in the steady, precise manner of a woman who had kept meticulous records her entire professional life, specifically because she had always understood that facts mattered more than impressions. Fairchild's cross-examination was careful and skilled. He established that Pomfrey had not been aware of the charms before the examination, no prior detection, no earlier report. He suggested this indicated the charms were subtle and well-constructed rather than obviously harmful, and that subtlety might reflect protective craft rather than malicious design. The sophistication of a weapon, Pomfrey said, does not speak to the intentions of its use. It speaks to the skill of its maker. Fairchild moved on. He tried the conflict of interest argument regarding Healer Stroud. Pomfrey dismantled it by pointing out that Stroud had been recommended by St. Mungo's standard referral process, not by the nation, and that her documentation predated Apollon's first visit to Hogwarts. He tried to establish that the physical and magical effects of the suppression were within normal variation for a magical child of Harry's age. Pomfrey looked at him with the expression of someone who had spent 31 years in a hospital wing and had extremely limited tolerance for arguments that contradicted clinical evidence, and walked him through Stroud's baseline assessments in sufficient detail that he dropped that line of argument before she finished. When Pomfrey returned to her seat, Fleur exhaled very quietly beside Harry. Flamel testified next. He was brief, precise, and entirely unimpressed by the formality of the proceedings in the specific way of someone who had been in more important rooms and found this one perfectly adequate. He established the historical context, Cassia Vorn, the 1326 law, the 6th century precedent. He explained, with the authority of someone who had spoken to Cassia personally and had access to documentation that most living people did not, that the law explicitly excluded intent as a mitigating factor. That this had been a deliberate choice, argued for carefully, and had stood for 7 centuries because the alternative, allowing intent to mitigate, created an obvious mechanism for abuse. Fairchild attempted to challenge his reading of the original charter text. Flamel looked at him with the expression of someone being told by a student that they had misread a book they'd written. I was present, Flamel said, at 3 of the 7 council sessions at which this charter was drafted. I have the session notes in my personal library. Shall I read them into the record? Fairchild withdrew the challenge. Harry testified after lunch. He sat in the testimony chair, which was designed for adults and therefore made him look smaller than usual, and he did not adjust his posture to compensate for it. He sat the way he sat everywhere, settled, straight, present. Mireille addressed him directly. You understand that you are here to describe your experience as accurately as possible. You are not required to characterize anyone's motivations. You are not here to argue legal points. Simply, what happened, and what it felt like. I understand, Harry said. Apollon led his direct testimony. She walked him through it in the order they had prepared, the examination, the diagnosis, the explanation, the removal process, the impact. Harry answered in plain language, without embellishment, giving exactly as much detail as the question asked for and no more. He described the 42nd charm release setting the table on fire. He described the 45th and the rattling windows. He described the 51st and the gold light in the room like a small sun. He described the feeling of having been a smaller version of himself for as long as he could remember and not having any vocabulary for why, because the vocabulary had been pressed down along with everything else. When did you first understand what your full magic felt like? Apollon asked. I don't yet, Harry said. We're at 58 removed. There are 25 left. So I'm still finding out. He paused. But I can tell the direction. I can tell the shape of the ceiling. And I know now that the ceiling was designed. It wasn't natural. Someone thought about how high I should be allowed to reach and then built the limit. He looked at the elder bench. That's what I want the record to say. Not that someone made a mistake, not that someone had good intentions and got the method wrong. Someone looked at me before I could walk and decided how much of myself I was allowed to be, and then maintained that decision for 7 years. That's what happened. Mireille nodded, slowly. Fairchild rose for cross-examination. He was good. Harry watched him come to the floor and recognized the quality of someone who had prepared very carefully and was going to be methodical. Harry, Fairchild began, and the use of the first name was deliberate, establishing informality, establishing youth. You've had a great deal of help understanding the legal aspects of your situation. From Madame Delacour. From her daughter. From Monsieur Flamel. A slight, careful pause. Is it possible that some of your understanding of what the charms were intended to do has been shaped by the people supporting you, rather than by your own experience? Which part of my testimony are you referring to? Harry said. Fairchild paused. It was a very small pause. Your characterization of the charms as designed to limit you specifically. Healer Stroud's analysis identified the architectural pattern of the charms before I was told about it, Harry said. Her notes are in the documentation you received. The characterization comes from her technical assessment, not from me or from Madame Delacour. He held Fairchild's gaze. Are you suggesting Healer Stroud's analysis was shaped by nation influence? I'm simply asking whether, because if you're making that argument, it would be in the record, Harry said, and I'd want to make sure it's clearly attributed. Fairchild adjusted his line. You said you felt like a smaller version of yourself. Can you be certain that feeling is attributable to the charms rather than to the general experience of childhood? I can compare, Harry said. I have been having charms removed for 6 months. Each one that comes off produces a measurable, documented change in my magical output and in what I can access. That comparison is in Healer Stroud's case records. If the feeling were simply childhood, removing the charms wouldn't change anything. It changes something every single time. Fairchild tried 3 more angles. Harry answered each one the same way, plainly, specifically, directing attention back to the documentation where it existed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show frustration. He answered the questions he was asked and didn't answer the ones he wasn't. After the 4th attempt, Fairchild said, "No further questions," and sat down. In the gallery, Amos Diggory was writing something very quickly in a small notebook. Mireille looked at Harry for a moment with those unreadable eyes. Then, "Thank you. You may return to your seat." Harry walked back across the chamber floor. When he sat down, Fleur put her hand briefly over his on the table, 1 second, contact and then withdrawn, enough to say that was good without saying anything. Dumbledore's testimony was the last. He took the chair with the particular dignity of a man who had decided, sometime in the month since October, to stop managing and start telling the truth, and who was finding the experience both painful and necessary. He admitted the charms. He admitted the renewal visits. He admitted that Petunia Desley had known and had been told the visits were necessary for Harry's safety, and that this framing had been deliberate. It kept her compliant without giving her details. He explained his reasoning in full. He did not minimize it, but he explained it clearly. The mate bond, if complete and active, represented a vulnerability that Voldemort could have exploited. A completed bond created a leverage point. Suppressing it removed the vulnerability. The logic had seemed sound. And now? Mireille asked. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Now I understand that the logic was sound and the premise was wrong, he said. The premise was that Harry's magical integrity was a resource I could allocate toward his safety. It was not. It was his. It was not mine to allocate. He looked at the elder bench without flinching from it. I believed I was protecting a child. I was also, in the same action, choosing not to ask that child what he wanted, because I believed he could not understand the full scope of what I was protecting him from. A pause. He has spent the past 6 months demonstrating that I was wrong about that as well. Fairchild did not cross-examine his own client. Mireille called a recess and the chamber emptied into an anteroom where tea and water appeared from somewhere and nobody talked very much. Harry stood at the window looking at Edinburgh in the afternoon, the grey stone of the old city, the castle on its rock, the specific northern quality of the light. Flamel came to stand beside him. "How are you?" Flamel said. "Fine," Harry said. And then, because it was Flamel, "I keep thinking about what you said. Casha's phrase. Identity murder." He looked at the city. He didn't mean it like that. Dumbledore. And it was still that. "Yes," Flamel said. "I'm not sure what to do with the gap between those two things. The gap between intent and impact." Flamel looked at the city with him. "You don't do anything with it. You hold both things." He meant well and it was still wrong, and both of those are permanently true, and you don't have to resolve them into a single verdict. A pause. "That is, incidentally, what took me about 300 years to learn. You're somewhat ahead of schedule." Harry exhaled something that might have been a laugh. The elders deliberated for 2 hours. When Mireille returned to the bench and the chamber filled again, the quality of the air was different, the particular charged stillness of a room waiting for a verdict that would matter. Mireille held the floor the way she always held a room, not by commanding it but by simply being entirely present in it. The Veela High Court finds as follows, she said. The documentation establishes, beyond the applicable legal threshold, that 83 instances of mate-suppression charms were placed and maintained upon the magical core of Harry James Potter, beginning before the subject's first year of life and continued through his 5th year. The architectural analysis by Healer Stroud establishes that these charms were not merely bond-suppressive but constituted a broader limitation of magical capacity. She paused. The chamber was absolutely still. Under Article 7 of the Veela High Charter, these actions constitute illegal magical interference with a minor of the most serious category. Intent does not constitute mitigation under this article, as established by Cassia Vaughan's Council in 1326 and maintained without revision for 7 centuries. A slight pause. The respondent's argument that exceptional circumstances warranted exceptional action is understood. It is not legally sufficient. This court does not issue exceptions to Article 7. That is the whole point of Article 7. She looked at the respondent's side. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore is found in violation of Article 7 of the Veela High Charter. The penalties prescribed will be communicated in formal written judgment within 7 days. For the purpose of this chamber's record, the court notes that the respondent's cooperation with this process and his direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing will be weighed in the determination of penalty. Then she looked at Harry. The sovereign designation of Harry James Potter is confirmed in perpetuity, she said. The protections of the High Charter are in full effect. This court recognizes Harry James Potter as a person of full magical identity whose integrity is under the permanent protection of Veela law. A pause. Let the record reflect that the sovereign was 8 years old at the time of this proceeding, conducted himself throughout with complete clarity and full moral seriousness, and required no coaching to tell the truth. Another pause, and something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. Cassia Vaughan, I think, would have approved. The chamber was quiet for another moment. Then Apollin's pen clicked as she capped it, and a sound released the room from the stillness, and there was movement and voices and the specific energetic exhale of a thing that has been wound tight for a long time finally being allowed to relax. Flamel, beside Harry, said nothing. He simply put one ink-stained hand on Harry's shoulder for a moment and then removed it, which was, coming from Flamel, practically an effusion of emotion. Fleur looked at Harry. Her eyes were bright and her composure was fully intact, and she did not say "I told you" because she was too composed for that, but the shape of it was entirely present. "Don't," Harry said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "You were." "I was going to say that you were excellent, and that Mireille specifically noting you for the record is something that will be cited in Veela law scholarship for at least the next century." She met his gaze. "That's not the same as I told you." "That's absolutely the same as I told you." She said, which was the closest she came to conceding the point. Outside, on the steps of the Conclave building, Harry stood in the Edinburgh afternoon while the city went about its entirely ordinary business below. He thought about 25 charms still remaining in his magical core. He thought about the record, permanent, formal, cited in scholarship, impossible to revise. He thought about Cassia Vaughan arguing for 40 years for a law that was protecting him 6 centuries later. He thought about Dumbledore in that chamber, still and clear-eyed, saying the premise was wrong. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel heavy. He felt like something had been settled, not resolved into tidiness, not made simple, but placed firmly in its correct category and left there where it belonged. The gold light came when he called it, steady and bright in his palm in the afternoon air, 25 layers still between him and the full depth of it. 25. He closed his hand around the light gently, felt it warm against his fingers. He could wait 25 more. Chapter 6, Sovereign's Choice. The last charm came off on a Tuesday in July, and Harry felt it the way you feel the end of a long storm, not the crack of thunder, not the final hard rain, but the moment after, when the air suddenly holds a different quality and you realize how long you'd forgotten what stillness felt like. Stroud had cleared the hospital wing of everything breakable 3 days ago, as a precaution. The windows had been reinforced. Pomfrey had placed a series of containment charms around the perimeter of the ward with the focused care of someone who respected what they were containing. None of it was necessary. The last charm lifted with a sound like a single low bell note, deep, resonant, felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears, and Harry sat very still for a moment with his eyes closed, and the world reorganized itself. Not explosively. Not with fire or shattered glass or the rattling of stones. Just, reorganized. The way a piece of music resolves to its final chord and you understand, only at the end, what the whole preceding movement had been building toward. He opened his eyes. The gold light was everywhere, not flooding the room, not uncontrolled, but present the way sunlight was present, filling the available space without effort, without aggression, just thoroughly and completely there. It came from him. Not from his hands, not from a specific point, from him entirely, as though his skin had decided light was a reasonable medium of expression. Stroud sat across from him with her notebook open and her pen not moving. Pomfrey stood in the doorway with one hand braced on the frame, and Harry could see that she was working very hard at being professionally composed and mostly succeeding. "Well," Stroud said finally. "Yeah," Harry said. "Does it feel?" She seemed to search for the question. "Like I've been sitting in a chair that was slightly too small for 8 years, Harry said, and I just stood up." Stroud wrote something down. Then she looked up at him, and she did something Harry had never seen her do in 8 months of sessions, she smiled. Not the brisk professional acknowledgement she sometimes gave when a session went well. A real one, full and unguarded. "Magnificent," she said, simply, and went back to writing. The light faded to its usual warmth within the hour. Harry was still Harry, same face, same slightly crooked glasses, same overlarge habit of wearing things that didn't quite fit because he'd spent 7 years in his cousin's cast-offs and was still developing opinions about what he actually preferred. The gold light settled back to its usual low presence, available rather than exhibited. But the room felt different around him. The air had a quality. Not overwhelming, not the Veela effect that made strangers stop walking, something more specific, more personal. Like standing near a fire that gave off warmth without needing to burn anything. Pomfrey gave him tea and sat down and they were both quiet for a while, which was the particular comfortable quiet of people who had spent 8 months in close proximity working toward a shared goal and didn't need to mark its achievement with words immediately. After a while, Pomfrey said, "How do you feel?" "Honest answer. Always." He looked at his hands on the table. "Like myself," he said. "For the first time. Properly." A pause. "It's strange to feel like yourself when you haven't got a reference point for it. I don't know what I feel like compared to, I've never been this before. But it feels right in a way nothing has ever felt right before, so I think that's it." Pomfrey made a sound that was technically neutral and was also absolutely not neutral. "Stop," Harry said. "I'm not doing anything," she said. "You're being emotional. I am being professionally supportive." Pomfrey. "I am a healer with 31 years of clinical experience," she said, firmly, and then she reached out and put her hand over his on the table the same way she had on the first day, and he turned his hand over and held hers back, same as then, and that was that. Flamel had stayed. After the hearing he'd gone back to Geneva for 6 weeks, returning for the final removal sessions with the ease of someone for whom continental travel was a minor administrative matter. He was staying in Hogsmeade, at the Three Broomsticks, where Madame Rosmerta had apparently given him the best room without being asked because, she'd explained to Pomfrey, he was 662 years old and seemed like he'd earned it. Harry fled to the Three Broomsticks that afternoon. Flamel was at a corner table with tea and 3 books open simultaneously, writing in the margins of all 3 in what appeared to be 3 different inks. He looked up when Harry came in, took one look at him, and closed all 3 books. "There it is," Flamel said. Harry sat down. There what is? The version of you that was under all of that. Flamel studied him with that long, sharp gaze. You're brighter. Literally and otherwise. Your mother had the same quality when she'd worked something out, like she was generating light as a side effect of thinking. I'm not doing anything specific, Harry said. No. That's the point. Flamel poured him tea without being asked. When power is natural rather than forced, it's ambient. It's the room temperature rather than the fire. He settled back. How do you feel? Everyone keeps asking me that. Because everyone who knows you has been waiting 8 months for the answer. Fine, Harry said. I feel like myself. He paused. I feel like I have things to do and I want to start doing them. Flamel looked at him with something that sat between satisfaction and interest. What things? The accountability process produced a verdict, Harry said. Dumbledore has his penalties. The formal record exists. But none of that changes the structural problem. He wrapped his hands around the tea mug. The charms were illegal. They were put on me by someone with enough access and authority that nobody stopped it for 7 years. Which means the access and the authority are the actual problem, not just Dumbledore specifically. You're talking about systemic change, Flamel said. I'm talking about making sure the legal mechanisms that should have caught this exist and work. He looked at Flamel. The Veela nation has Article 7. Britain has nothing equivalent. A child could have a single suppression charm placed on them and the British ministry's current law treats it as a minor interference, roughly equivalent to an unauthorized unlocking charm. You've read the current statute. I've read everything. A pause. I want to change it. I want to push for a British equivalent to Article 7, not identical, it doesn't need to be, but functional. Serious penalties. No intent defense. Mandatory documentation. He looked at his tea. Apollon thinks it's possible. The hearing got attention. The accountability verdict got more attention. There are Wisengamot members who are paying close attention to how this lands politically. Flamel was quiet for a moment. You're 8 years old, he said, not as an objection but as a factual observation. Kasia Vorn was 23 when she started arguing for Article 7, Harry said. She spent 40 years on it. I have time. Flamel made a sound that was too specific to be a laugh and too warm to be neutral. Yes, he said. I suppose you do. He picked up one of the closed books and reopened it. I have some contacts in the Wisengamot. Old ones. People who have been there long enough to remember what the law looked like before Fudge's administration began treating it as a personal management tool. He opened to a page with a margin note in red ink. I will make some introductions. Harry nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me. It's in my interest to live in a world with better law. He looked at Harry over the book. Also I find you interesting and I have 6 centuries of experience with boredom. Keeping you supplied with work is a form of personal entertainment. Fleur arrived the next morning. Not just for a visit, she was staying through August, while Beau's batons broke for the summer. She arrived with 2 trunks and a stack of books that had their own separate carrying case and the particular focused energy of someone who had been waiting for a thing to happen and was now ready to deal with the thing itself. She looked at Harry when he met her in the entrance hall and she looked at him the way Flamel had, taking inventory, updating something. Right, she said. Right, he agreed. How does it feel? Flamel asked that. And Pomfrey. And Apollon in her letter. And now I'm asking. Like myself, Harry said, which was his answer and was accurate and was also, he found, all he needed to say. She nodded once, as if this confirmed something. Then she said, I want to show you something. Not today, tomorrow, when you've had time to settle. But tomorrow. What is it? Ward construction. Practical application. She shifted the bookcase under her arm. Now that your magic is complete, or essentially complete. Stroud said there will still be some integration time. I want to test a theory. What theory? That your magic has properties that make ward construction significantly more effective than standard practice allows for. She looked at him evenly. The theoretical basis is in the papers I sent you in May. The application requires your actual magic rather than projections of it. A pause. If I'm right, you can construct protective wards at a level that most adult practitioners require a team of 5 to achieve. Harry looked at her. If you're right. I'm usually right. You're often right, he said. I'm right about ward theory specifically, she said, with precision. The margin for error in the theoretical framework is less than 2%. I've checked it 4 times. He thought about being shown Fleur Delacour's ward theory application on the morning after his magic became fully his. He thought about the blueprint he'd been trying to describe to her back in November, the one where he didn't know what he was building yet but knew what it should not be. Maybe this was part of what it was. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed, and went to find Pomfrey about the guest quarters. The ward demonstration happened on the south lawn, which had enough open space to work safely and enough distance from the castle's existing protections that they wouldn't interfere. Fleur set up the theoretical structure in chalk on a flat piece of slate, clear, precise diagrams with small neat annotations in both French and English, and explained what she was proposing. Standard protective ward construction worked by layering spells over a defined perimeter, each layer adding a specific function: detection, deflection, containment. The limiting factor was always magical throughput. The amount of power a single caster could sustain was finite, which was why complex ward systems required teams. The theory Fleur had developed over the past year posited that with a magical signature of sufficient depth and ambient output, the limiting factor shifted from throughput to architecture. The question became not how much power you had but how well you could structure it. And you think my signature qualifies, Harry said. I think your signature obliterates the throughput problem entirely, Fleur said, with the matter-of-fact directness she deployed when discussing things she'd verified thoroughly. Which means if your architecture is sound, and I will build the architecture, the ward system you can construct alone should exceed most team-built systems in both stability and complexity. Harry looked at the chalk diagrams. He'd read the papers she'd sent. He understood the theory. What do you need from me? I'll walk you through the structure. You'll cast to my specifications. She looked at him. Trust the architecture. Your instinct will be to adapt as you go. Don't. The structure is precise for a reason. You don't think I can follow a structure? I think you have good instincts and they'll want to optimize mid-cast, she said. Which will work eventually, when you've done this enough times to trust your instincts about structure specifically. Today, follow mine. Harry considered this and decided she was right. All right. The casting took 40 minutes, which Fleur said later was exceptionally fast for a first attempt at this complexity. Harry followed her architecture, building the ward system layer by layer, and felt the structure the way he sometimes felt a really good idea, like the pieces had been waiting to fit together and were grateful to finally do it. The magic moved from him not in forced bursts but in a steady, purposeful flow, and Fleur stood at the perimeter calling adjustments in quick precise French that he'd learned enough of by now to follow. When the last layer locked, the ward system was visible for about 3 seconds, a faint lattice of gold light, intricate as a spiderweb, covering the south lawn completely. Then it settled below perception, present but invisible. Fleur walked the perimeter, testing integration points, her wand tracing small diagnostic arcs. Her expression was focused and quiet. Harry waited. She came back to where he was standing and said, 42% more stable than the best comparable system I found in the literature. Detection range 3 times standard. Containment capacity, she looked at her notes. I'll need to run proper measurement charms, but visually the containment capacity appears to exceed St. Mungo's primary perimeter ward. Harry looked at the invisible ward around the south lawn. Is that normal? No, Fleur said. That is entirely not normal. She looked at him. I was right about the throughput. You usually are, he said. She looked satisfied in the controlled way she was satisfied when she'd confirmed a theory, pleased, and then immediately thinking about the next thing. We'll do this every day while I'm here. Different structures. I want to map what you can do. So you can publish it. So we can use it. She put her notes away. There are applications beyond theory. You know that. He did know that. He'd been thinking about it since she'd sent the first paper, the defensive implications, the protective applications, the fact that a sovereign under Veela law with the ability to construct better protective wards than most ministry teams was a very different kind of protection than the kind that had been attempted on him for 8 years. You could teach me the architecture, he said. Not just follow it, understand it. So I can build my own. She looked at him. That's a year of theoretical study minimum before practical application. I know. You're 8. I'm aware. She tilted her head. You want to learn ward construction. I want to be able to protect people properly, Harry said. Not depend on other people's systems. My own. He looked at the south lawn, at the invisible structure of gold that was sitting there quietly doing its job. The wards at the Dursleys, the blood wards Dumbledore set. Those were someone else's system, built around someone else's theory of what I needed. I want to be able to build my own. Fleur was quiet for a long moment. The July morning was warm and the grass was bright and the castle rose behind them, enormous and settled, full of its own ancient protections. I'll teach you the architecture, she said. Starting tomorrow. It will take as long as it takes. She paused. You'll be a better student than most because you'll actually read the theory. I'll read the theory, he agreed. Don't try to optimize until I tell you to. I'll try not to. That's not the same as won't. No, he admitted. She gave him the look she gave him when he said something she was choosing not to argue with because she understood it was accurate. Then she picked up the chalk slate and headed back toward the castle, and Harry fell into step beside her, and the ward on the south lawn held steady behind them, strong and clean and quietly doing exactly what it was supposed to do. In August, Fudge made his last serious move. It came in the form of a formal ministerial statement, delivered to the international magical press and simultaneous sold to every major wizarding government, arguing that the Veela High Court's verdict represented an unprecedented and unconstitutional interference in the internal affairs of Britain's wizarding governance, that Albus Dumbledore, a decorated Order of Merlin recipient, former chief warlock of the Wizengamot, and universally recognized defender of the wizarding world, had been subjected to foreign judicial process without appropriate British oversight, and that the Ministry of Magic would be pursuing formal diplomatic remedy through the International Confederation of Wizards. Harry read it at breakfast in the Three Broomsticks, where he and Flammel and Fleur had fallen into the habit of working in the mornings. He put it down. Picked up his tea. Set the tea down. He's desperate, Fleur said, reading over his shoulder. He's scared, Harry said. Those are different. Are they? Scared people do desperate things. Scared people also do predictable things. He looked at the statement again. He's made 3 arguments here, and only the third one has any teeth, the International Confederation claim. The first 2 are noise. He looked at Flammel. The Confederation claim. Can he make it stick? Flammel set down his book. He can make the argument. Whether it sticks depends on what the Confederation wants, and what the Confederation wants is almost always determined by which way the political wind is blowing. He considered. Currently the wind is blowing toward a recognition that Britain's magical governance has some significant structural problems. The sovereign case has made those problems visible. The Confederation is not, on balance, looking for an excuse to defend those structures. So it's noise too, Harry said. Mostly. But noise can do damage. Noise can create delay. Noise can make the accountability verdict feel contested even when it isn't, legally. Flammel looked at him. What are you thinking? I'm thinking the answer isn't a counter-statement, Harry said. The answer is making the proposed legislation so visible and so concrete that attacking it looks like attacking child protection rather than defending British sovereignty. He looked at his notes on the Article 7 proposal. He'd been working on it for 6 weeks now, Apollon consulting, Flamel reviewing, a draft taking shape. When's the earliest the Wisengamot could hear an introduction? The autumn session begins in September, Flamel said. Then we introduce it in September. Harry looked at the ministerial statement again. Fudge is trying to make the conversation about foreign interference. We make the conversation about what the law should be. Nobody who votes on legislation about protecting magical children from suppression charms wants to be on the record opposing it. Not publicly. He paused. Not right now, when the whole wizarding world knows what happened to me. Fleur was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was revising an estimate. What? He said. Nothing, she said. You're doing the thing. What thing? The thing where you see the whole board, she said. Not just your position. All of it. She went back to her tea. It's the thing that makes you very useful and occasionally very annoying. How is it annoying? Because it means I can't surprise you, she said. He looked at her. You surprised me when you corrected the ward architecture on Thursday. That was a structural error on your part, not a surprise. You were pleased about it. I was accurate about it. Fleur. She set down her tea. Fine. Mildly pleased. She picked the tea back up. Don't make it significant. Flamel, behind his book, appeared to find something about the page he was reading extremely interesting. Apollon arrived from Paris on the last Thursday of August with the final draft of the proposed legislation, which had been through 11 revisions and was now, in her professional opinion, watertight. She spread it on the table in the guest quarters, and Harry read every page while she and Flamel discussed the Wisengamot political landscape, and Fleur sat cross-legged on the end of the bed reading Healer Stroud's published case report on Harry's suppression, which had gone out to the international magical medical community 2 weeks ago and had already been cited 6 times, and occasionally made small sounds of agreement at specific passages. Section 4, Harry said, when he'd finished. Apollon looked at it. The intent clause. The wording is still slightly soft. He pointed. This says cannot be used as sole mitigating factor. It should say cannot be used as mitigating factor. Full stop. No qualification. The softer language was a compromise to get Wisengamot members who, I know why the language is soft, Harry said. I'm saying it shouldn't be. The whole point of Article 7 is that there are no exceptions. The moment you allow intent as partial mitigation, you create the argument. Every single case that comes after this will be about whether the intent was significant enough to qualify as more than sole mitigation. He looked at Apollon. We don't want that argument. We want the law to be clear. Apollon looked at him for a moment. Then she took out her pen and changed the wording. There will be pushback from the Compromise Coalition, she said. Then we'll push back, Harry said. Flamel turned a page. Fleur made another small sound at Stroud's case report. The penalty structure in Section 7, Harry continued. Scaled by number of charms and duration. I want a provision that the sovereign designation triggers automatically at the threshold set in that section. It shouldn't require a nation filing every time, it should be automatic. That requires the British Ministry to formally recognize Veela sovereign law as applicable to British citizens, which is what Fudge has been fighting against, Harry said. Yes. But it's also what the International Confederation will recognize as appropriate given the precedent set by my case. And it makes the law actually functional. He met Apollon's gaze. If it's too hard to fight for, it's not worth passing. Apollon held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote. Anything else? Section 9. The documentation requirements. Every magical health examination for a child should include a standardized suppression scan. Not optional, not triggered by complaint, standard. Built into routine healer practice. That requires the British Healer Governing Board to update their examination protocols. I know Madame Pomfrey personally, Harry said, and she will be the most enthusiastic advocate for that amendment that the Governing Board has ever encountered. He paused. She's already drafted the technical specifications. She sent them to me last week. Apollon looked at him. Then at Flamel. He planned this, Flamel said, without looking up from his book. I planned the parts one could plan, Harry said. The rest we work out as we go. They introduced the legislation to the Wisingamot in September. Harry attended in person. Apollon had arranged visitor status through the nation's legal standing, and the chamber had been remarkably unwilling to argue the point. He sat in the gallery with Flamel, who wore the expression of someone observing a historical event and finding it satisfactory, and watched Apollon present the framework on the chamber floor with the precision and absolute calm of someone who had been preparing for exactly this for her entire career. The debate was long and sometimes heated. Ragnald Peel made several speeches about British sovereignty and constitutional tradition that were technically articulate and morally empty, and which several of the younger Wisingamot members challenged with the particular energy of people who had read Celeste Marine's published interview and drawn their own conclusions. One Wisingamot member, an older witch named Augusta Longbottom, stood up during the third session and said that she had served on this body for 22 years, had seen a great deal of legislation pass and fail, and that any member of this body who voted against legal protections for magical children against identity suppression would have to explain that vote to their constituents and to history, and she was confident in both cases that the explanation would prove inadequate. The chamber was quiet after that in a very specific way. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. But it was sufficient. Section 4 had the unqualified intent clause. Section 7 had the automatic sovereign trigger. Section 9 had the standardized scan requirement. Harry sat in the gallery and watched the final count and felt the quiet, weighty satisfaction of a thing actually done, not perfectly, not without compromise, not without the knowledge that implementation would take years and there would be fights over every detail of it. But done. In the record. Permanent. Flamel, beside him, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, Kasia would have liked you. You've said that before. It bears repeating, Flamel said, which was exactly what Harry had said about his mother, which was either coincidence or something more resonant. That evening, Harry sat at the edge of the Hogwarts lake in the September dark, which had become his thinking place the same way the hospital wing had been his working place for most of the year. The water was very still. The stars were clear. Somewhere in the castle behind him, Fleur was in the library finishing the theoretical framework for the ward construction curriculum she was building. She was going back to Beauxbatons in 10 days, for her final year, and she was leaving him with a 2-year study plan and the direct instruction that he should owl her every time he had a question rather than trying to work it out alone, because working things out alone was efficient but she found the questions interesting. He heard her before he saw her, the particular quality of her footsteps, which he'd been aware of for 9 months and which he recognized the way you recognize the voice of someone you've been listening to carefully. She sat beside him without preamble, the same as always. They were quiet for a while. You did something today, she said. We did something today, he said. Maman did the legal work. Flamel provided the historical framework. You set the direction. She was looking at the water. That is not the same as sharing the credit equally. Without the direction there's no destination, Harry said. Without the destination, the legal work and the historical framework are just components without a structure. That is also, she said, a very Fleur Delacour argument. You've been teaching me ward architecture for 2 months. Some of it was going to sink in. She looked at him. In the starlight her face was clear and composed, and something underneath the composure that he'd been learning to read, not hidden, just quiet. She was not a person who expressed things loudly. She expressed them precisely, at the right moment, to the right person. When I come back, she said, from this year at Beauxbatons. You'll be at Hogwarts properly. Starting next September, Harry said. Yes. Different schools. For a year. Then I'm at Hogwarts for 7 years and you'll have graduated beaux batons. He paused. We'll still be writing letters. Obviously, she said, as though this were so self-evident it barely needed saying, which was its own kind of warmth. They were quiet again for a moment. The bond, Harry said. The mate bond. We haven't talked about it directly. No, she agreed. Do you want to? She considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. I think the bond is a fact, she said carefully. Like your magic is a fact. Like the ward theory is a fact. It exists. It will always exist. What it becomes is determined by what we choose to make of it, and that choice requires time and information and the actual knowledge of each other as full people rather than, she paused. Rather than a destiny handed to us by someone else's law or someone else's magic. So not now, Harry said. So when we're ready, she said. Which is different from now and different from never. She looked at him. That's exactly right, he said. That's what I would have said. I know, she said. That is why I said it first. He laughed. And she let herself smile, properly, fully, the smile she kept for things that had actually earned it, and they sat by the lake in the September dark, two people who had chosen each other's company with full information and no obligation, which was worth considerably more than destiny. The morning she left for beaux batons, Fleur found Harry in the corridor outside the guest quarters at 7:30, which was earlier than she'd expected him. He was holding a small package, wrapped in plain paper. He handed it over. She opened it. Inside was a book, Theoretical Ward Construction, Advanced Level, her own copy, the one she'd given him in November. She looked at the inside cover. He'd annotated it. Every margin, every page, 9 months of notes in his precise small handwriting, questions, corrections, extensions of her own arguments, places where he'd tested the theory against his practical casting and found discrepancies and worked out why. It was, she realized, not just a returned book. It was a record of what they'd built together, the theoretical framework for the ward curriculum, his additions to her work made more complete by his engagement with it. In the inside front cover, in slightly more careful handwriting than the margin notes, he'd written, for teaching me the architecture. I'll build the rest. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her bookcase with great care. You're going to be a problem, she said. Probably, he agreed. At Hogwarts. You'll take everything apart and put it back better and the professors won't know what to do with you. Pomfrey will help with that. Pomfrey adores you. That's not the same as managing the professors. Dumbledore is changed, she allowed. But the others. McGonagall, Sprout. They'll be fine. Flitwick will be excellent. She tilted her head. Snape will be a challenge. I've been told. Don't let him make you small. I know. I'm serious. I know you're serious, he said. I haven't been small in a year. I'm not going back. She looked at him with those clear eyes. Then she picked up her trunk and slung the bookcase over her shoulder and said, I'll write when I arrive. I'll reply when I've read the ward theory paper you left me. It will take you 3 days. Probably 2, he said. She was already walking. She raised one hand without turning, the same gesture from the hospital wing window, almost a year ago now, acknowledgement and warmth and everything in between, and he raised his. The gold light went with his hand, warm in the morning corridor, and did not go out until long after she'd turned the corner. He was 8 years old. He had 25 charms removed and 83 documented and a legal designation that predated the Ministry of Magic and a piece of legislation with his fingerprints on it working its way into British wizarding law. He had a healer who had locked her office door and gone back to him without panicking. He had an alchemist who was 662 years old and found him interesting enough to keep showing up. He had a speaker who had told him the truth about how he might be used before they'd even said hello, and put his choices in writing before he'd asked. He had a mother he'd never known who had been fierce and precise and not afraid of anything she thought was wrong. He had a girl with silver hair who had sat on the end of his hospital bed and corrected library margins and taught him that the architecture had to come before the instinct, and who had said when we're ready in the exact right tone, and who he was going to write a letter to in 2 days that she would receive in 3. He had his magic, all of it, fully his, the ceiling gone, the room as large as it had always been supposed to be. He walked back through the castle toward the hospital wing, where Pomfrey had breakfast waiting because she always had breakfast waiting, where the September light was coming through the east-facing windows in long warm angles across the stone floor, and he walked through it and it caught the gold, and he did not make himself smaller to step out of it. He walked through the light and he let it be his.